So we've had a few times we've caught up, but this time I'm introducing you to people in my life, basically. And so this is Dr. Bruce Bierman. This is the guy responsible for getting me into continental philosophy, which is to say all the Marx and Heidegger and Levinas and Foucault and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and everything else, Lacan, Žižek, all of it. So guilty.
Yeah.
Maybe you could introduce yourself and just talk a little bit about how you got into philosophy and what you've been up to teaching it and what kinds of stuff you teach.
I've been teaching at Gonzaga now for a decade.
A decade?
Yeah, 11 years precisely. And then I taught at North Idaho College for many years. I taught at the Spokane Community College for a couple years. At the same time, I've taught at Gonzaga, but I've always been at Gonzaga for whatever reason the whole time. And I've taught a lot of classes. I've taught logic, a lot of that, a lot of ethics. I had you in ethics first.
Yeah.
That was the first class you were in.
I think so.
And that's always a very fun class to teach.
I think I took another class with you, right? Or did I sit in on another class with you? Might have been like a 101 or something.
Let's see. Yes, you took Introduction to Philosophy with me actually second. You took ethics with me first for some reason. Usually it's kind of the other way around. Yeah, I remember that. I've taught Introduction to Philosophy. I've taught classical or Greek philosophy. I've taught Asian philosophy. And I did one class on existentialism once.
Oh, yeah.
At the community college, which was really fun. So anyway, I've taught fairly broadly, and I've taught to both community college students and to the fairly privileged students of Gonzaga. So it's kind of I've kind of been all over the place, and also I like to teach people who are not even in school. Like I've had lots of sessions where I just got together with people I knew who don't, they've never gone to college or whatever, but they were interested in like something that they picked up, and I just happened to talk to them in a coffee shop. And I was just like, hey, let's like hang out and talk about this too. So I see myself as just broadly liking to talk about philosophy with anyone who will listen.
Sometimes you get paid for it, sometimes you don't.
Yeah. More often than not, it seems like, with the wages I get. But anyway, yeah.
So you got your doctorate. When I met you, I think you were working on it. Is that right?
No, I have not finished my doctorate. No, I have an MA. Yeah.
In May?
I have an MA.
Oh, you have an MA.
Yeah. Which is why my wages are horrible.
Really?
Yeah. No. So yeah, I have not completed a doctorate. No.
Is that to say that you're working on one, or that you paused one?
No, I have not. I have not even begun a doctorate program. No. Yeah. No. When I got out of doing my MA, I was offered a job, so I started taking it. That was in the middle of the quote-unquote Great Recession. All my friends at that time couldn't even get into grad programs. I got one friend who got into a grad program. He never got a job when he got out. And then, for example, I have a friend who he'd been working adjunct for quite a long time, and then he finally decided to go back to law school, so he quit that. So I don't know whether I made the right choice or not the right choice, but I had a job, so I took it and thought, in like 2 years I'll apply to schools and stuff. But anyway, I didn't. So I've just been teaching with an MA this whole time.
I think I was also really impacted by your ethics class, because I think philosophy is a way of life. Philosophy about thinking what is the good life, or what would how ought I to live, has been, I think, central to me, and maybe because of you, I don't know, but it was like, that was definitely kind of how I was already interested in philosophy. I think you probably gave me like an orientation that was like, oh, okay, ethics is first philosophy, right?
Yeah.
And, but I think, yeah, so just for people who aren't really into philosophy, just really quick, how do you usually talk about what you teach to people who don't know the branches?
I usually do start with that kind of question, like, what's the best life for the human being? In the ancient world, and I think that they were right, they understood the priority of that. How should I live? the question, how should I live? Or essentially, are there better ways of living? So you look around at different people. Some people look like their life is going really great. You think, what are they doing that makes their life so good? Someone else, they look like their life is just going to shit. You ask yourself, what did they do wrong or whatever? So people just naturally think about this. Of course, Socrates was the one who begins this formally as a philosophical question. But like even if you take someone like Epicurus or whatever, you see that what they thought as metaphysics and physics were just orientated around that. Like if I know what the world is like, that helps me know how to live. Like Epicurus sees us as being just wholly determined by nature. So understanding physics is important to know how I should live. So he's a hedonist. Basically, we're just biological, newer terms, I think he would probably just say machines. That like every other animal, we move away from pain and we try to indulge in pleasure, but we're rational, so we should be intelligent about which pleasures we indulge in, right? So that's just his frame. Where someone like Plato says, no, the physics or the metaphysics is much broader, and ultimately, like, we're soul. We're this ultimate being in the universe. Therefore, understanding that helps me know, like, how I should educate myself, how I should live. Epicurus and Plato, very different perspectives. But anyway, I think most everybody's interested in the question of, is there better ways of living? Or someone's already interested in some particular thing. They think, well, this is really cool and I'm really interested in this. And usually I just take that as the jump off point, because there's few students who start with metaphysics and they're like, oh yeah, what is like cosmic reality and how does self fit into that? Usually people don't start there, they start somewhere else and move up towards that.
Well, I think most people nowadays would think if they want to be asking or thinking about these questions, there's self-help and business success type books, there's religious type, sort of evangelical how to live books, there's science, positive psychology. Do you think that these questions really are the domain of philosophy? And if so, what's wrong with those other fields, or how might they not be able to respond to certain parts of the question?
That's an excellent point, Dave. Most people, they find their answers to questions about self or how best to live from religion, science, or something like business acumen.
The 7 habits of highly effective people.
Right, exactly. Philosophy is different because philosophy asks the questions behind the frames. See, when I was younger, that's what really opened me up to philosophy, is because I realized they sort of asked the questions behind the questions, which nobody had taught me. I didn't understand, for example, that science has this particular frame, which is that it only answers questions within the domain of empirical science, that is what is testable from a hypothesis within the empirical realm, which is essentially the 5 senses. But then you start getting into physics, right? And then you start reading like about Niels Bohr or the Copenhagen interpretation. You start to realize there's a point where science can't do that anymore. You can't verify. The verification principle of truth has to be something that if I write a treatise and a formula and you read it and you follow the formula, you'll get the same result, right? Now you can't even do that with physics anymore. Like string theory is purely mathematical theory, and nobody thinks that in the foreseeable future that we'll be even able to come up with a hypothesizable test to prove whether it's accurate or not. This goes all the way back to, say, Plato. Plato says, hey, look, you can do all this stuff with math, and it exceeds like what you could do in the empirical realm. But anyway, he's just I think he's just like being facetious and like mocking people and things that he does. But the same thing, anyway, you get to this point in science where you realize, well, science can only take me this far, and after that, it can't answer certain kinds of questions, right? One of the most famous questions, of course, is the biggest metaphysical question, which is, say, God. Does God exist? Pretty much every religion says that God exists space and time, in the major majority of religions. So right off the bat, you have something that exceeds space and time. It's not going to be verifiable. It's not going to be testable. That's why Kant says that God is an antinomy. It's not
what?
An antinomy. Remember the antinomies in the Critique of Pure Reason? So it means it's neither testable as false or true. It exceeds the human ability to actually articulate. So I can't write a treatise on God that would be demonstrable within the empirical sense because it exceeds space and time. In fact, very few students want to read Kant, or they read like 5 pages of Kant and they're like, yeah, I read some Kant. But it's exceedingly difficult to understand what philosophy really does without reading Kant, I think, because he sets that out. So anyway, religion has a frame, right, which is usually some sort of doctrine. Like we go this far, like the average Protestant will say no farther than the Bible. If you can't point to something in the Bible, then I'm not going to listen to you anymore. That's just your authority or whatever. The Catholic will usually say if it goes beyond the realm of the church, the discussion is over. The same thing with maybe a Muslim talking about the Quran or something like that,
or scientists saying if it wasn't written.
Right. If it's not in the empirical testable, then we go no further. So philosophy actually tries to ask the questions within that. One of the things that I think Socrates does very importantly, like within the Euthyphro, is he asks questions like about virtue, about like if God is essentially not virtuous, is he God? I'm paraphrasing insanely broadly from the Euthyphro, but right.
We've been reading some dialogues together.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I mean, the Euthyphro is breaking down that. Plotinus later says, "What is God without virtue?" Which is a great question. Like if
God's evil, is God God?
Right. If God has all these powers, which the Greeks saw, but behaves in a way that you would never want your neighbor to imitate. So like in the Euthyphro, like he brings up the problem of like, if I please Poseidon, then I piss off Zeus. If I please Zeus, I piss off Poseidon, because they're at war in the pantheon of gods. So it's sort of like, so is the good loved because it's good, or is it because the gods love it? So this is a question about virtue. And I think in contemporary terms, I often think about like the concept of like an ever-burning hell. Like if God burned people forever, would we want any kind of person to imitate that behavior? And therefore, can it be true?
Probably not, except there's a couple of people I could think of, maybe they should be burned
forever. Which in the Greek, that word is actually aeon, and aeon actually means an age. It can mean forever, but anyway. But so you can apply it. So that I think if Socrates was alive today and he was talking to like a Southern Baptist, maybe he would ask some question like, well, would you want your neighbor, if he had that power, to use that power? Even Hitler couldn't use his power to torture Jews forever because he lacked it. So this is question about power and then virtue, and the idea in Socrates is essentially like, if there's a lot of power but there's no virtue, it can't be the highest. The highest must be good as well as powerful. Is that true? But he opens up this whole possibility or domain of always asking questions. Whereas within the religious frame, you stop somewhere. The scientific frame, you stop somewhere. Within business, you stop when it doesn't help you make money anymore.
Which is why you shouldn't study philosophy.
Right.
Yeah.
It's sort of like reverse Confucianism. Like you try to learn how to be very good in your comportment, but only to con people to get more money. Not like for the comportment in itself enriching you, which would be something closer to Socrates or Aristotle in that sense. But the standard business acumen is not about like internal excellence. It's about, what do I get out of it? What if I behave in this way, what do I get in return? Whereas like Plato and Socrates like wanted to ask the question in itself. I keep bringing them up because they started the Western tradition. So, I mean, Heidegger goes back to reading like Plato's dialogues, like closer to the end of his life, to try to rediscover questions. And he interestingly said that nobody should start writing until they'd read Aristotle for 10 years.
I know, and this is stupid, but I also I like this idea of failing fast.
Yeah.
Right, and so, because I was kind of intellectually or mentally like constipated, and one of my closest fellow travelers and friends was just like, just do it, just spit something out, and then if you fail really quick, and then you'll. But anyway, yeah, I've been going back to Plato and Aristotle.
You have to start.
And it kind of just it's this. I wrote this book to 20 people.
Cool.
To 20 people, so that 20 people know where I'm at, and so it's not published through Routledge or something like that.
Right.
We started for tax loophole purposes and legal purposes, I made an LLC for this. But then the person who encouraged me to do this, I knew it would actually make a difference if he held his own work in his hands. So I took these. He does this writing that he gives away for free, but it's read in grad schools all over the country and world, and people are really serious about it. But he doesn't have any degrees, and he's working 50 hours a week and supporting his mom. This is Michael Downs. I've mentioned him before. He's the author of the Dangerous Baby blog, and he and I have done conversations about Lacan, and he's a Lacanian Žižekian, right? That's his main thing. But he and I also have had a million conversations about Heidegger and Levinas and all these other things. Baudrillard's huge for him.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we put together a couple of we took all of his Lacan posts, put it in a book, and then we took his How Jouissance Functions in the Workplace book, and then we just sent those to him, and he got them in the mail. He didn't even know that they were coming. But it had the psychological impact that we knew it would on him, that it also did on me. And now we're doing it for Ann too.
Yeah.
So at this point, we're calling it an underground press, and it's basically we're rappers with our mixtapes out in front of the grocery store.
Yeah.
For books.
But for 20 people, and just keeping it that way.
No, and that's how you have to start. The flame, the one candle lights one at a time. And I think people have this kind of absurd idea, with mass consumerism that, you have to start big. That might be true if you're selling some sort of, T-shirt or something. It's not true about ideas.
Right.
I don't, especially when the access to that requires that the person themselves be in a kind of place. You can't get people to just read philosophy because it's difficult and it requires a kind of dedication that I don't think. I mean, if you look at the history of philosophy, right? Philosophy is not mass consumption, and it never was. It starts from one person to another. And that's Plato's. He has the notion of the masses or the hoi polloi. The many are not going to take on philosophy, but the people who are ready for it, the people who. It's very interesting because, for example, I have very bright students at Gonzaga, and they have to take 4 philosophy classes as an undergraduate.
And that's just a Jesuit thing?
Yeah, it's a Jesuit thing, which is cool.
Jesuit students all have to take 4 philosophy and then 4 theology? Is that how it works?
No, they have to take 4 philosophy, and they can substitute their 400 level for theology.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, I have these students that are very bright, and they do all their work, they do all their reading and so forth. But when they're done and they write their papers and they get an A, they'll never go back to doing it. It's because to them, in the business acumen, it's just a gateway. They're taking their classes just to get A's or good grades so they can go out into the business world or whatever and make money. Their goal is just to make money. They're not really concerned about asking this more deep question about who am I? Socrates says you take yourself wherever you go. So, people think that success is going somewhere, getting something. They don't think they take themselves wherever they go. They don't think that they can be a billionaire on a beautiful beach and they can be just miserable as fuck. But they can be.
Yeah, you're still you.
Because you take yourself wherever you go. And, a lot of them will realize that when they get what they want, and then they realize this wasn't it. So now what is it that I want? Then they might start asking self-questions, but then they'll be 45 or something. I don't know how old they'll be, 50, 60, I don't know, on their deathbed. Somebody just told them they got cancer. So the question of formation of life, I think, has to be something that people are ready for whatever reason.
Formation of life.
Yeah. because I definitely see it in the Greek sense that ethics or ways of being is a techne. It's like it's an art. So life is a form of art, just like painting or any other thing. It has all these aspects of composition, and you work on it maybe for a very long time. But there is a difference between a beautiful painting and a skilled painting and one that's crap and very poor. And you can see it. And for the Greeks, the word kalos both means good and beautiful at the same time. So Socrates plays on this a lot because if something's good, it's beautiful. And he likes to use like men, men work out, and then you look at that and you're like, that looks good, and it's also beautiful. But how did they get it? They worked at it, right? They're working out every day. They're going for runs. They're, body sculpting, which the Greeks did. They had weights, and they had personal trainers, and they had dietitians and everything. So it's a craft. It's an art. It's something you work at. But people can see and it's just you. It's great when it's the body because the body's yours. It's there. But what Socrates wants to take is just the body, and then he wants to go to the mind and be like, isn't the mind even more cool and more sexy and more interesting?
I know you think I'm sexy.
Yeah.
But wait until you hear my ideas.
Yeah, right. Because he apparently had this belly, by the time he's 70 years old, and he's a little bit balding, and so he gets made fun of by Aristophanes for this and so forth. But yeah, it's this kind of joke, like I'm an old man, I got this little punch, and I'm losing my hair. But the soul is sexy, right? Like, and I can talk to you, and when I talk to you, it sparks all this shit in your mind, and you're like, whoa, that's cool, I never thought of that. And that's sexy. So, yeah, he always takes like the example, and then he ups it to some other more sophisticated concept of the self over and over again. And if you're reading the dialogues, you see this all the time. And
so far, Anne's big takeaway.
Is there not dialogues? It's just him like talking at these people and they go, yes, I couldn't agree more. And then he goes, but on the contrary, and then lays out like the totally opposite argument for them.
And then they're like,
that makes sense too. Like whoever the pupil is listening. We've only read a couple, but I just like, this isn't a dialogue.
Some of them are, more Socrates than the interlocutor. That's especially true of like Crito. Crito hardly gets a word in edgewise. The Euthyphros fairly like that. Euthydemus has some of that. But in other ones, like I think about the Charmides or something like that, a little bit. I don't know. Anyway, it goes.
She'll do this thing though that like she'll be like, yes, Socrates, yes, Socrates.
Yeah. And they have like T-shirts making fun of this, right? Because it's
really?
Do they?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, because it's true. There's a lot of them where you don't really feel like there's a fair conversation going on. It's just him, and every once in a while they agree.
And then in whichever ones we read, he goes, but what do I know? Like,
I've been talking this whole time.
I don't even know,
What
guys.
he's like, I don't know they're all the right answers. I don't know for sure.
But then you pan out though, and it's like the whole dialogue, we'll call it a dialogic tree instead, or maybe what's the word for a monologic tree? The whole thing though, like you see, he got their assent here, their assent here, their assent here, their assent here. Every time they gave their assent, that contradicted the other times they gave their assent. So now they're gonna have to walk around for the next few months thinking, I can't believe all these things at the same time. And he's ultimately trying to get them to feel, wait, I agreed to all those things, but all those things do not work. Dang it. Dang it, Socrates.
Plato wants you to see that it's personal, and usually the character that he's using is trying to teach you something specific about a certain kind of self. And so you see that especially in like the Republic. You have bronze souls who are like Cephalus and Polemarchus. Then you have Thrasymachus and Glaucon who are silver souls. Then you have Adeimantus who's a gold soul. And the way that he talks to them has to do with the kinds of desires that they have. And when they stop talking to him is when basically they can't hear him anymore because their desires are such. Like with Polemarchus and so forth, the interest is they're very material. In fact, they were arms dealers. And so there's a humorous connection in that first part of the Republic where he says, would it be wrong for me to give back a sword to someone who is going to do harm to themselves? So here's these people selling arms to people who are going to get into big wars with each other and kill each other. I mean, he's almost less than veiled bringing something up.
And does he say that to the might makes right people?
Yeah, it's at the beginning with Polymarchus and his father.
The guy who had to go sacrifice.
Yes,
he's like, I gotta go make some sacrifices.
out. Yeah. So when the ethical question of like their business comes up, which is essentially he's like, is it right to keep living this way? Then he goes off to make sacrifices because he's also worried about the afterlife now. He's like, oh shit, like I better go. And again, just like a business guy, right? He thinks he's gonna pay money to slaughter a bull or something, and then that's gonna appease the gods. Like I can buy him off with something because that's his mentality. He's like stuck in that mentality.
Well, I make a big tithe every Sunday.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I can exploit my workers.
You buy real estate in heaven, right? It's like I can be an asshole my whole life and exploit the workers and other people in different countries and whatever, but just so long as I give my big tithe or I do this, then like it's okay, I'll buy real estate in heaven. And it's kind of an investment sense. You're like, well, even if it's not true, I did put some money in there, and if it doesn't pull out, I put a lot of money in a lot of places, So that kind of mind. And yeah, Socrates is trying to like move, but he never gets it. Like he's just like, oh, I better go make more sacrifice since, oh man, I might be in more trouble. I'll just kill a few more bulls,
Yeah.
So, and what you're kind of getting at also is just the fact that there's a lot more going on than meets the eye when you first read a dialogue.
Absolutely, yeah. It takes, I mean, like repeated readings, I think, of a dialogue to see, and you should read it in Greek. See, like I learned Greek. I'm actually I'm learning Chinese right now, so I've been reading through the Analects of Confucius with Dr. Quanvig Liu, who's my colleague at Gonzaga. And it's just been super awesome. So I've learned Greek, Hebrew, Sanskrit, and now I'm learning Chinese now. So, but like if you read it in Greek, like you really see how funny Plato is. Like it's like he was supposed to have died with an Aristophanes play under his pillow. So it was the last thing he read before he went to sleep. And if you read Aristophanes, you see how much he actually imitates Aristophanes. Like all the dialogues.
Was a comedian, basically.
Yeah, biggest comedian in town at that time. He wanted his dialogues to be entertaining and funny, but at the same time be subtly educating. Usually students who kind of don't give a shit about these bigger questions, very subtly educating them in this sexy sort of fun way. Here's this old guy who nobody likes, who goes around barefoot, wearing the same cloak, but whenever he talks to these authority figures, he like undermines their hypocrisy and their foolishness and whatever. And young people love that, right? I mean, it's like rebellious, but it's funny. It's like funny. And in the Greek, there's all these puns and all these euphemisms to dirty things. Like he talks about like endurance a lot. Like one of the interlocutors wants to leave and he's like, you need to have more endurance, which the Greek word is like the same word we use like when we talk about sex endurance. Like so he's like joking with like, yeah, you hang in there. You don't want to be weak now, you'll be weak in the bedroom later, So there's all these really funny jokes like constantly played out, and the English translations I think are getting a little better, but the truth is like you just have to footnote things constantly if you were going to actually try to get at everything he's doing in there. And like I say, there's all these subtleties where he's teaching you. For example, the early dialogues often end with no resolution. And I remember when I was young, I was like, why the hell did I read this? This is a waste of my time. Like they didn't even resolve this. But the whole point is like, why is it unresolved? See, like he gives you two things. He gives you Socrates and then the interlocutor, and he wants you to think of a third thing. So that there's this perspective, then there's that perspective. They go. Socrates says, oh, too bad. We didn't figure it out. Like you said, 3 weeks later, epiphany is going to break in this kid's mind who he's talking to, but he just lets it stop there. So Plato's doing this because he wants you to see two perspectives that neither are good enough, and then have you think of the third one. So it was a practical exercise in philosophy. So you're supposed to read the earlier dialogues first, and then the middle dialogues, and later dialogues, and so forth. So a lot of the ethics questions don't get resolved, and then later they get more resolved, like in books like The Republic or The Laws or something like that. Plus he uses analogy all the time. Like all of The Republic is an analogy for the self. It is not about politics. And the laws is not about politics either. It's about power of the self. But you have to learn how to read Plato, which can take a while. Or some people are just backwards ass minded. I mean, there's very intelligent professors who write books on this stuff, and I'm sorry to say, like they're reading Plato in this wooden kind of weird literal way. I don't even know how they do it.
Professor Ben Burgess, you know him?
I don't know him, no.
So
not personally.
He gets published by Zero Books. He's a leftist. He goes on podcasts and I think he goes on videos and talks about. He wrote a book called Logic for the Left, and he wrote another book called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. And so he's kind of a cool logician guy, but I don't think he's kind of into Rawls. I think he's got a little respect for Marx, but it's kind of like about Marxists, and so. But he's kind of a sock down, I think, is probably a way of thinking about it. But yeah, I'm friends with him on Facebook, and he's doing the public intellectual on Facebook thing. So he makes his posts like he would his Patreon updates. But one day he said something about how he's teaching a class on Plato's Republic and talking about Plato as being a fascist, and I was like, oh no!
Yeah, no.
That's what I did. I did that. You called me out for it. You were like,
no.
You were like,
and you understand why, right?
Like,
that's what matters. Is why.
Right.
If I just say that and then you say okay, but when you read it and you see.
The hinge point for me. I always come back to the hinge point. Is when Glaucon's like, what is this, a city for pigs?
Yes.
And which I say it that way because it's memeing off of the Zoolander. What is this, a school for ants? When he throws it on the ground. Yeah. And then Socrates is like, you're right. So okay then. I guess we're going to need a standing army. And I guess we're going to need these noble lies. And I guess we're going to need a division of labor and a class society. And he rolls out the fasci stuff.
Yeah. It's the silver souled stuff. It's the end of what you're talking about is the beginning of the book 3. The very end of book 2 is so important because Glaucon says nobody's really defended the good in itself, and he says I want to know why the good is good irrespective of consequences. So either like wealth or honor. Why should I be like you, Socrates, who says at the end of the Apology, I'm unpopular, I have no money. Why should I be like you? I want to know why the good would be worth it in itself. And Socrates says, okay, I want to answer your question on Glaucon, and I don't want to manipulate you. So we're going to have to do something. We're going to have to he says, like when you have children, you give them the big A, and then they learn the big A, and then they learn the little a, and then they can learn their writing. So he says, we have to take something big that we can see, which is the city. It's perceivable. We look around. They're in the Agora, or they're not in the Agora in that case, sorry. They're at the party. Anyway, but it's something you can see. It's perceivable. And then you use it for the little a, which is the state of the self, which is psychology, emotion, social, biological states, all kinds of shit, right? The complexity of the self is just like the complexity of the city, and it has all these different layers. So that the whole of the Republic right there at the end of book 2 is made explicit, that the whole reason they're doing it is for Glaucon. Glaucon wants to know why he should be good in itself, irrespective of consequences, which is going to be the bronze-souled stuff and the silver-souled stuff. And then, like you said, he makes the divisions at the beginning of book 3. He starts chopping everything up. The whole thing is an analogy for the self. The whole thing is a book about how should I live, which is why should I be plain old boring good if it doesn't give me power or money. All that takes you all the way up to like book 8, where Glaucon finally says, now I can see from this portrayal of the tyrannical state, but they go through the oligarchical state, they go through the democracy, they go through the democracy and the aristocracy. All of those are states of the soul, right? So basically, I'm not saying that Plato isn't winking sometimes and being like, look, we could make a better city-state. But everything, he sets it up right there as being an allegory for the state of the self. And the problem is, like, analytical philosophers, again, they'll tend to, like, try to break it down, and other dialogues, too, in a way where they think everything is analytical or logical arguments. I had a logic teacher who said, if you try to go through Plato and you try to look for logical forms like modus ponens and stuff, you're not going to find it. And if you look at literature at that time, it wasn't like that. Aristotle hadn't come around yet. It's after Aristotle that these things started changing. Yeah. Plato's just not trying to do what, say, Aristotle is trying to do. He writes humorous dialogues that are full of purposeful myth. He uses myths, which are analogies. He uses allegory. He uses symbolism. He uses humor, and irony is really big. Sometimes when Socrates is saying something, he's saying the opposite. Aristotle's not like that at all. Everything's literal, everything's straightforward, everything's in a sort of treatise manner. So people read Aristotle and then they look back at Plato and they're just like, what is this?
Yeah, this is real philosophy, so what was going on over here? Is it true, or have you heard that supposedly it's just that Aristotle, his dialogues didn't make it, but he also wrote dialogues, and Plato also apparently wrote treatises that didn't make it. So both of them were doing dialogues and this stuff, but then we only get half of each.
Yeah.
Have you heard that?
Yeah, so this was a historian who came like 300 years after the fact, says that Aristotle wrote quote-unquote golden dialogues, which were supposed to have been very beautiful. But we've never found like a single fragment. So I'm not saying it's not true, but at the same time, I mean, we found archaeology actually unearthed like Aristotle's like will. We actually found that. We actually found a fragment of the beginning of the Republic, where you see that Plato wrote out just the very first phrase of the Republic. I believe it's 47 times. That is, all in the English translation, it only says, "As I was going down to the Piraeus." That's all it says. He practiced 47 different ways of giving that. I use this example to my students to tell them nothing in Plato is accidental. He wrote out the first line in 47 different possible variations and then chose the one he did very carefully. Now, papyrus already costed a lot of money, so most people didn't write anything down until they were ready to, like, I'm ready, I'm serious. They weren't like at the word processor where you're just like, or Hunter Thompson, that's what I like to think of as Hunter Thompson with his cigarette, you know, he's just like hammering at the typewriter, you know, stream of consciousness. Plato, Aristotle, all these people, they were not doing that. There's no like accidental stuff. So anyway, I mean, here we find some fragment of that, for example. We've never found a single fragment of any of Aristotle's dialogues. And when you look at everything else he writes, I have a hard time believing he wrote at least humorous or golden dialogues. That I think it more likely that Plato had lecture notes. That might have been true, but we haven't found those either. So. And they may just be gone, and it may be true. But because Aristotle is so humorless, the only place in the Nicomachean Ethics that I ever thought maybe Aristotle is being funny, and I don't think that he is, but it's the only place that I could ever find, and I've been teaching it for 10 years, is where he says that you can't commit adultery in the right way and in the right time and in the right proportion, because he says that everything has to be done in those ways that are good. Some things are just evil or wrong, and therefore they can't be done in the right way, in the right proportion, in the right time. And I don't even think he is being funny, but that's like the only place I've ever seen where I wonder, like, maybe he was being funny.
Like, you laughed.
Yeah, like, I don't know, but everywhere else, like, he's humorless, so it's hard
He's
for
dry.
me. Yeah.
That's the thing, is like, people either they really found a lot of traction with Aristotle, and then when they were reading the dialogues, they were like, what is this? Or they read the dialogues and they were like, wow, big ideas, and then they start reading Aristotle and they're like, this is dry.
Yeah.
And this is kind of like the split between continental and analytic philosophy,
Yeah.
but like the early version of it.
I think you're hitting it so well, perfectly. There is always a predisposition in philosophers to tend towards either just pure rational, sort of cutting up the text, and then looking at premises and conclusions, looking at the argument, looking for weaknesses, and then the more other poetic people who read in a different way. And they're the kind of people who look at allegory, play on words, higher kinds of meaning, this literary way, and that's very much like Plato. So you have this very much at the very beginning of Western philosophy. And you have it in other schools. I mean, you can look at Indian philosophy and look at the poetry of something like the Upanishads. But then if you look at some of these earlier Indian philosophers, they're exceedingly analytic. I mean, amazingly, way before Aristotle was ever born.
Right.
So when you get to the 18th, 19th century, you start to get this division, especially after Kant.
Kant's the breaking point.
Yeah. People start to go towards just this heavily analytical and scientific perspective. This is all we can do. This is all its philosophy is supposed to be. And then existentialism, essentially.
German idealism,
Yeah.
structuralism, existentialism, phenomenology.
So
Yeah, whatever's on the back of my book, she says.
So Kant is responsible for this divide because in the Critique of Pure Reason, he basically lays out from an epistemological point of view what we can reasonably do in philosophy. And especially the analytics said, okay, we're going to stay within this realm alone and just stay with the kind of language that can be communicatable in an analytical way. But then even Wittgenstein, you have the Tractatus, but then by the philosophical investigations, he's like jokes, talking about music or art, poetry, all these things, like they do have truth and they do have meaning for us, but clearly we can't make them reducible to analytic philosophy. I mean, like Nietzsche said, write a treatise about music and all you do is like ruin what music is. I mean, music is just, you experience it, it transforms you, it does something to you that you can't explain, but it has a truth and a meaning to it. But it's not in the way that I write a treatise on it and you're like, oh yeah, that's exactly what Mozart was getting at in whichever symphony. It doesn't work like that. So the existentialists went with the freedom part of Kant because Kant said the mind has spontaneity or imagination. And then they went with, well, what does this mean? Not what is communicable only in this way. But it took a long time because academically the analytics and the analytics school really took charge, and so you have people like Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and people who are not, they're outside of everything that they're writing is not going into the academic world. And usually this is true. The academic world is going to stultify itself in its own self-congratulatory committees and going to this and that and the other. And then somebody really creative outside is going to write something so groundbreaking that pretty much after they're dead, will start coming back into the universities and these people will have to teach it. But universities as institutions tend to destroy imagination because you just have a student who learns from the master and then they become a master and then they teach their student. And then it becomes codified, regurgitated, whatever. And then to get new blood, you have to have somebody who's completely outside of the system who comes up with some new revolutionary idea. And that's pretty much, even the people that they try to point to as being academic, like Kant, he was basically like an adjunct professor. He was barely getting by. His friends thought he was going to freeze to death in the winter because he had so few clothes and this really thin coat. And he didn't get any of his academic ability until he had to teach all kinds of things like math and science and stuff to just low-level students. until after Critique of Pure Reason. So he wrote his greatest book, and it took a while to catch on. Then he gets a position at the university. Hegel goes and teaches the equivalent of high school for more than a decade. He's teaching a bunch of high school students. He's writing Phenomenology of Spirit and Science of Logic and stuff. And then finally he gets it. So even these great thinkers that we usually think of as being kind of stuck in the ivory tower like Kant or Hegel, they actually didn't get into it until after they'd written their most important work.
Wittgenstein left mid-dissertation,
Yeah.
taught grade school students for a long time, finished the Tractatus, dropped that, disappeared again for a while. Received a giant inheritance, was one of the richest people in the world, but instantly rejected the inheritance.
It all away, And even when he was teaching, he had a very small stipend. So he was teaching students, like literally he had classrooms of sometimes like 6 students. But because back at that time, in the UK, you could actually, you could get a fellowship that would pay you enough to survive, and then you could just have this very small, sort of Cambridge-style small group where everybody's smoking their pipes in a room. I love that kind of notion of like 6 people who all want to read something, and that's who he's teaching to at the era just before he's just filling up the notebooks for philosophical investigation. Very small groups of students. So he has no notoriety. I mean, it's someone like Bertrand Russell who has the notoriety at that time, not him.
I'm not just saying that's just the way it is, and that's the way it maybe always has been, but she's been studying the neoliberalization of the university, and so I thought maybe I'd drop that and walk over here, and I'll be right back.
Yeah, please tell me about that.
Yeah. So I studied sociology down at Boise State, and they have this really cool research cohort called the Intermountain Social Research Lab, where students will get together, and kind of the goal is to do research around the neoliberalization of the university, and so students can kind of pick an area of interest under that. And so my first year, so they did it for 2 academic years. My first year, I was not really sure what to do. I wasn't quite into sociology and Marx and all these theories and thinkers enough to really know what I wanted to do. So I was like, oh, I don't like football. So I kind of focused on the social and athletic life and how that takes away from academic life, the funding and students' mindsets and how they approach the university and their social life. But the next year, I was like, I have to do this again because I have a way better idea. So it was kind of looking at the outcomes of the university in terms of why are students there, what do they want to get out of it, do they actually value their learning, and because we did interviews with the students. That was kind of our main method of data collection, so asking them their thoughts and opinions on the liberal arts and if that has value to them, and what do they want to be doing with their lives versus what are they doing in college. And you get these contradictions of oh, I wish I could be studying journalism or theater, but I just have to do something practical. And then students asking them, well, what do you hope for your life outside of graduation? What are you most afraid of for your life after graduation? And like you were saying, they just want to make money because they think that's what's going to get them to have a good life. And so this raises this broader question of kind of, you were talking about, what does it even mean to have a good life, to be a person? Who are you in this world? And so doing research with that, I was working directly under the head of the sociology department, and so he actually reached out to me over last summer and said, hey, do you want to be an adjunct instructor and teach a discussion group there's this required course at Boise State called University Foundations, and so they offer it at a 100 level and a 200 level, and the 100 level they are kind of just fostering oral communication skills and critical inquiry, but various departments get to kind of assign a topic, so you're teaching a topic at the same time teaching just these skills, and this book called Becoming a Learner is kind of the main text of this class.
Cool.
And so the sociology department created a section called Is College Worth It? So directly stemming from this Im Searle research. And so that's been really eye-opening, going from being a student and having my own opinions on what I thought the shortcomings were of my experience to like a researcher interviewing students to now like an instructor and being in that position and noticing what I'm noticing and like, you know, grading papers and just seeing this attitude about school and about why they're there, and they're just, yeah, I just need to get a job. I don't even know why I have to take this class. We're talking about big, important ideas on why are you here in school and what are you getting out of it.
Yeah.
They're like, I don't know why I'm here. Just need to get a job, you know. Just need to take practical majors.
You already talked about the interviews with Searle and people just saying, yeah, I picked my university because I want a job with Micron.
Yeah, our students
Right.
saying, I'm looking at these grad schools because I know that this corporation and this corporation hires directly from there. But then at the same time, we'll ask them about their thoughts and opinions on like the corporate presence at the university, or like about what they think about corporate desk jobs, and they go, I don't like that. I don't like that corporations are, you know, influencing the university, but I'll go work for one. And so like just it's total contradiction of these ideas and how they're living their life versus what they value. And I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Fisher's work on capitalist realism, and so that was a big inspiration for me, thinking, yeah, these students are not only capitalist realists, but they're fatalists. Like they're fatalistic about their lives in the sense that they know what they value. They want a good life, but they're not actually going to put in the work to really consider what that means because they can't, because that's not practical. That's not going to get them the business degree to get them a job, which actually you look at it and it's like you can get a job with any bachelor's degree, master's degree, because they're looking for general skills and can you learn, but there's more of a focus on I need to learn technical job skills. Why am I taking a sociology class or a philosophy?
It's very interesting because, I mean, when I was an undergraduate, I felt like that too. I was just very practical, and I thought, well, I just need to get a job. So I was like, I was going to be a nurse. I should be a nurse right now. But it was because I started reading these different things that my mind started opening up. It was not, unfortunately, I don't have like any mentor professor that I remember that I thought, well, this person changed my life. I just started reading things and that opened things up to me. But what's interesting is when, like for example, at Gonzaga, we do polls like 10 years or so after students have come and asked them about their experiences and which classes they found most helpful and so forth. And what's interesting is that the humanities ones are the ones that people poll the highest with. Those are the things that help them now in terms of their sort of soul. Like they have a job that they wanted and they got the job they wanted at wherever, Intel, whatever. But then they realize the job is killing them. And the only thing that keeps them alive is like, the 20 minutes in the morning where they read poetry or Jane Austen or you do something creative like a painting or drawing or something, because everything else is so meaningless, so soul-sucking, that's the thing that's actually keeping them alive in the midst of all of this.
Yeah.
And so capitalism has created this picture of like do or die, like either you follow money success and you survive or you die. At least that's the way they portray it. And so it's like you have this sense that and you're young too. I mean, you don't know what the hell. In high school, nobody's giving you these options virtually anywhere either, right? So there's no philosophy classes in high school. The very paradigm, like what should I learn, or that I bring this up to my students, and it's like a revolutionary concept to them. Like there's better ways of living, and like the art of the self is an art that you perform. And just it's very simple things like I read the Gorgias with my students or something, and they start to realize, because in the Gorgias Socrates pretty much goes through this process with his interlocutors of these main kind of concepts, which is like you use knowledge to get wealth or to get power. And then Socrates is basically like, well, maybe you should use it to order the self. If you put the self in this best order, it'll be like this beautiful music where you have a orchestra of all these different people and all these different musicians and all these different instruments, but they make one beautiful sound with the music that they all follow. But to them, they're just sort of like, what the hell are you talking about? He doesn't even end in that, and the Gorgias dialogue with convincing Callicles. Callicles is not convinced. So either I have students who are like, I'm not convinced, or they're like, oh, that's cool, but I can't afford to do that. And my mom paid for me to go here. I gotta get this degree in, the safe bet. Yeah.
The thing you said earlier was like a lot of them end up leaving your class thinking, oh, I finished it, I got the grade, on to the next thing. But you're also saying 10 years later they're gonna pull. That was actually the most memorable thing I did. Once they've gotten a taste of what they think they had to get to next, then they're like, oh, that's why the humanities matter. Now I know.
That's what I hope. It's just too bad because that's when you're making your decisions, right? And if somebody gave you more options, I mean, more and more schools like North Idaho College recently, maybe they've been under review for accreditation and so forth.
Oh, really?
They're under review. I mean, they could potentially lose it. I don't think that they will, but they're being reviewed for it because the people there have tried to just continually cut back all the other courses that are not directly related to making money. What happens when you take ethics? They were going to take ethics out. What if students don't learn ethics at all? What if they don't learn basic logic? And I mean, the logic we teach is not higher symbolic difficult. It's just basic kind of like know how to discriminate between this bullshit and that bullshit. What if we don't teach? Those are what make us people who are more self-aware, who are more ethical, hopefully. These are both taught by the philosophy department. That's why I bring those two up. Not to mention the absolute reverence I have for people who teach poetry and literature and art and so forth. The person that you are is what you take to your work world. And if you take a person who has this cutthroat business perspective and no ethical perspective and no sense of self-cultivation, and you put them in a job, I ask you whether you want to sit next to that person and work with them all day.
Yeah, that book that's required in the class, Becoming a Learner, the whole purpose of the book is asking students, or kind of reminding them, you're not in college to learn how to do something. You come to college to become like who you're meant to be, to become a learner. Who are you becoming in college? And it kind of mentions, like, a person who is lazy and doesn't critically think and doesn't know who they are is not in high demand in the work world. And I think students just come in with this, very practical, just, I don't care what I'm doing right now and the reflections that I'm having, what kind of person I will be at the end of this journey.
Yeah. When I teach the reasoning course, which is essentially the logic course at Gonzaga, that's what I always start with, and it's thankfully on the first page of my textbook, so I can jump off from that. But in college, we don't teach you what to think, we teach you how to think. So in high school, you're used to just having to learn a bunch of stuff and then regurgitate it on an exam. But when you go get a job, people don't want that. That's what a computer's for. If you just information, that's worthless. They need you to take information and create something that never existed before, maybe in the history of humankind. You're going to invent some technology or software or idea or something that wasn't there. If you become this regurgitator person who just memorizes facts and then puts them back on the exam, you have no ability to invent. And so I think there's a real question about whether even at a college level we're succeeding in that, or whether in large part we're still just doing what you do in high school, which is you teach your students to regurgitate and not to think.
This book we were in, when we were in Seattle, we went to that Left Bank bookstore, that little anarchist book collective, and we're like, let's just get a book that we normally wouldn't get. But this one, it's Weapons of Mass Instruction by John Taylor Gatto, kind of about the ideology that was going into the creation of required schooling, mostly K through 12 public schooling in the 1800s and 1900s. And I just really this ideology from people working with the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and even boards of education who are all influencing this. It's very mask off, there's going to be people who get to gain knowledge, and everyone else, we want them to be subordinate and working in our system, so we just need to teach them to do what we think and to think what we want them to think.
Right. I mean, it's sort of like the pharaohs, you have somebody at the very top and then they give instructions to the people below that, and then those are the only two people who think, like the pharaohs and then the overseers, and then everyone else is like the slave.
Yeah.
And the slave is not supposed to look at the you know, the schematic of something that's being built and understand it, or the math of it. They're just supposed to put one brick onto another. And I think the same paradigm is becoming even true within what people think of as creative work, like Google. It's not. It's an ad campaign to make it sound like it's creative work. No, there'll be some people up above who are giving the orders, and everyone else will be doing the legwork of putting one brick on the other. So it's destroying the possibility of creative work, or creative minds, I would say. And then you take yourself wherever you go. So if 8-9 hours of the day you're being taught to just think in this tired, regurgitative way, what kind of person are you? And if you're submissive in everything that you're being taught at work or in school, what kind of political citizen are you? You're just somebody who just goes through like, well, somebody else is taking care of that. Just leave it to those who are in charge. You know?
Yeah.
And let the world burn.
Yeah, I mean, this book spans, I mean, a few centuries really. He's constantly bringing in these quotes. He talks about Hegel and Fichte and their influence on the Prussian system that we adopted, that was like meant to regiment and like factorize. And Foucault talks about that in the second half of Discipline and Punish, right?
Right. Yeah.
With the Bell system and everything like that.
Absolutely.
But then he also talks about Woodrow Wilson saying there's going to be two classes of people. One will be this and one will be that, and he's like explicit about that. When Wilson and Woodrow Wilson's the one who worked with the Allies to invade Russia in 1918, right after Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution, and so Woodrow Wilson is the beginning of anti-communism.
Oh yeah.
And Woodrow Wilson said, no, there will be two classes of people.
Yeah.
And then that's when the public education system that we know of was founded. And then this is the Rockefeller General Board of Education. Their statement says, in our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present, and then they just go on, and we've got these quotes.
We will not make men of science, or authors, educators, poets, or men of letters. The task we set before ourselves is very simple. We will organize children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers or mothers are doing in an imperfect way. So just like
mask off.
Mask off. This is our goal. We don't care about you or your life or your well-being or who you're going to get to become. We get to decide that, and you'll just be cogs in our machine. You can go home and watch Netflix on the weekends for your fulfillment.
Well, and I mean, think about how much work went in this country when you look at it historically to just constantly bash the idea of say, Marxism or communism or anything, constantly in whatever way, whether it was from a religious perspective, whether it was, no, you'll all end up jobless, it's impracticable. Certainly, I mean, there was no sense of just like, well, I'm an intelligent person. I can read it, and then I can see whether it looks right or not. There's just like this complete sense of trying to keep anyone from thinking it's possible at all. No, it's totally impossible. It's just some pipe dream, whatever. But then you think, well, but everywhere you see people who work together for common goals, and they don't have one person telling everyone else what to do. I mean, like the tribe of Spokane Indians, like had that. I mean, you had a sense of people decide things together. They choose and do things together. So primitive culture has a sense of sharing, a sense of collective decision, a sense of resource use that is looking at everyone else's needs.
Interdependent stake.
They didn't have one tyrant king who was like, all of you guys are going to go gather fish and whatever and do whatever I say, and then at the end of the day, I'll divide up how much you get, and then I'll take 80% of it for my household, and the rest of you will get just enough to live today so you can go back to work tomorrow. But I think that's not a false analogy. I mean, the picture that's given there by Wilson and then continually being followed is a one of hierarchy sounds nice. It's almost close to totalitarianism, right? Of a very small echelon of people who get everything and everyone else who do what they're told. or cogs in the wheel, and also people who have to be deeply indoctrinated. And I think that, I've been working in the educational system, so like I said, various places, 10 years. I see a lot of people who I like, who are very intelligent, wonderful people, deeply indoctrinated.
Yeah.
What is indoctrination then to you, as far as?
Well, it's certainly not, some kind of simple propaganda notion of like, here we give you like these ideas or leaflets or whatever. It comes from multiple points, right? I mean, begins with your upbringing. It comes from the multiple points of power. When you think about Foucault, where just when you're tired and you're already teaching 4 classes, somebody in administrations is asking you to do this. You don't necessarily agree, but you're tired, and so you're like, I'll do that. But then it becomes a habit. And then after a while, you justify it to yourself, whereas at first you're like, I don't agree with this, but I'm too tired to go against it right now. After a while, you're just like, this is my spot. They pay me. If I make noise, it's just going to cause me trouble. Probably nothing's going to happen. So I'll just keep doing this. Right.
So indoctrination is not
it's multiple
tenets
levels
or articles of faith that you just subscribe
No.
to, but it's also your habits. It's also like the limitations on your imagination.
It's Foucault is what I'd like to, like when he talks about power from multiple points, that when you slowly become, I think, indoctrinated into a point of view, which for maybe a long time you were very skeptical of, or when you compared 2 systems, you didn't think that was the better, but eventually you side with that, comes from a lot of sources, so many that it's hard to even enumerate, which is why I think, Foucault is very important, because systems of power and systems of economy very much reinforce each other. If you have money, you can enforce your ideas so much better than if you have no money, because you can simply disseminate things, and you can also create institutions where there's a hierarchy where people are rewarded who follow the idea essentially that you want, and those who are not, who are essentially segregated, without it ever being obvious that they're being segregated because of, say, race or religion. No, it's simply because they're not following the tasks, so they don't get promoted. And it sounds like it's about work, like, oh, he works harder than he works. No, it's not about that. And the people who promote the one guy over the other one, they don't even know what they're doing either, because they were trained into doing that, and they got their position to it through many years of that same subtlety too. And eventually you just learn how to go along with the program. But I also don't think that I'm not a behaviorist like B.F. Skinner or something. I don't think that we're completely enjoined to a kind of behaviorism. Fundamentally, I think creative ability and spontaneity in people shows all the time that they don't have that. But I do think that 8 hours a day, if you go to work like that, or 8 hours a day you go to school like that, that's not helping you. Because, the definition of intentionality or consciousness in Husserl is consciousness is always consciousness of. So what's your consciousness of? So if all day your consciousness is of, and then at night it's like Netflix till you go to sleep, and then you wake up, you get your coffee, what is your mind? It's not that your mind doesn't have ability to break forth and think interesting things and do different things, but if you're constantly, this is the reinforcement of capitalism, right? If rent costs this much, food costs this much, gas costs this much, car insurance costs this much, etc., then I have to work this much. How much free time do I have? Well, not a lot, and even when I do, usually my free time is only my recuperation, so that I can go back and work the fucking job that's killing me. Yeah. Not creative. The creative is something that comes from an excess, an overflowing of energy and power. Then you write books, or then you paint pictures, or then you become a political revolutionary. A dead dog tired person who's half sick with diabetes from their job and their work for however many years, you can't expect them, it's not fair to expect them to be a revolutionary or a painter or a poet or a philosopher.
Or have thoughts.
Or even, right, they're just subsisting. Like they're almost like a sea sponge. Like they're just there and they're absorbing what nutritions they can, and they're excreting, they're absorbing, they're excreting. and they're so fucking tired. And so, a lot of people Chomsky gave an interesting example about a mafia don. You can go, a mafia don comes to you and he puts the pistol to your head, and you say, "Fuck you," right? But then he points it at your child. Then you say, "Okay." So there's a lot of people that they would revolt, but they love their children, so they keep going back to their job. They do it because they don't feel like, I don't know what I'm going to do, and I have to take care of my kid. I love my kid. See, so there's this, like, you're just forced to constantly be working just to pay for the things that every year they come up with some way of making a little bit more, and the wages stagnate, they don't go up.
Yeah.
So that's the problem of labor as a commodity. That you don't overcome capitalism until labor is no longer a commodity.
Right.
If my labor is equitable with any other thing like barley or gold or any other thing, or my labor is in relation to your labor, then we're all screwed, because those things, the other commodities will go up, and then our labor will stay the same or whatever, and then we'll be slaves. But even in a nicer way, because they can say, well, you're not a slave, you're free to go wherever you want. Well, you mean I'm free to go live in the ditch and be a homeless person, but we're not forcing you to do anything.
Well, and how that all ties in with the schooling thing is just also that, and they say this, we don't want people who get too much of an education, their expectations get too high, they become critical of the system, and then but how that ties into, for me right now, the political moment for the last, especially 5 years there was a left populist moment, and it wasn't perfect, but there was at least that moment with Bernie, and then that got, obviously it didn't go so far, and it got pretty easily co-opted, and it was only a moment in the last 20 years. In the last 20 years, Thomas Frank characterizes as being inherently anti the little guy from the Democratic Party side, and that started with, Bill Clinton was practically a Reaganite. He comes in here talking about, well, the only way to get out of your shitty situation is through education, and what he meant by education was professionalization. And so he would say, you earn what you learn, and so the solution will be to give people the opportunity to become specialized professionals, but if they don't take those opportunities, then it's their own fault. And so it's like this, and he talks about the professionalization of the Democratic Party, and it's kind of turned away from working class towards, well, look, you can get out of the working class if you want to become a professional, and we'll help you with that.
Right.
And if you weren't privileged, then we're sorry, and we'll try to help you a little bit more. But the fact is there's people who need to be janitors because they really were jack-offs in school, and then there's people who deserve to be part of the professional managerial class because they learned how to get A's on tests.
Right.
And then it's the legitimation narrative of meritocracy, which is also the hyper fracturing and distinction and competition between everything and everyone, the atomization that through the schooling system, through the grade system specifically, all of a sudden you see yourself as distinct from people who are like 6 months younger, 6 months older, who are like one step behind you in math, one step ahead of you in English, and it's just and one of the things he's talking about is with Woodrow Wilson in the introduction here. It was a direct response to 1917. That the grading system itself was a method of you call it the reification of class divisions, but of
you have to decide who's going to be the ordering and who's going to be ordered.
Yeah.
And notice as soon as you set the frame that way, there's no other place. Can I be a free person doing something else? No, I have to belong to the economic structure. Well, what's the economic structure? The economic structure at this point is already largely going to be new technologies, a lot of them war technologies, or technologies that were essentially applicable to war. I mean, we have the internet because it was developed through people who were working for national defense, right?
I thought you were going to say people who wanted to do free stuff and be freedom, and
No,
I was
no,
going to be
it's
like,
not.
no, it's CIA, man. You
Yeah.
gotta know.
No.
It was developed by anti-communists.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, like, but one of the things that I see now so much is the technology industry is one of the only places, for major work. Which is why Anne brought up different students and so forth, that they're specifically thinking, I need to get into a technology industry. They have a secure position, and so there's this professionalism. There's no sense anymore of like, I want to go be a farmer, really, because you can't. I mean, economically, we started getting so much exports because it was cheaper, and various things, the consolidation of land through less and less people. And anyway, I mean, my grandpa was a wheat farmer, so like I kind of know about like the sort of change that went on through just the last few generations. But one of the biggest problems, I think, is just like with education and in general, is nobody's saying like, here's the other option. Like that there is another option. Like Badiou talks about this, and he talks about democratic materialism, and it's the idea is like, this is the only option. But when you really ask yourself what the meaning of your life is and what the outcome is, it's suicide. I mean, the first one is environmental. If we keep playing this idea that there's infinite growth, which is absurd, we're going to kill ourselves. I mean, we already are. I mean, the plastics didn't start coming out in a major form until like the 1980s. Look how much plastic is in the ocean now.
Yeah.
Just from that, I mean, that's not that long when you think about the history of civilization or something like that. So environmentally, I mean, we can't keep trying to privilege those who keep trying to do things cheaper in the way that doesn't give a shit about anyone else. And the money just goes to one group. I mean, that's not going to work. We have to start learning to use resources for what matters, which means asking the question, what's best for the life for the human being? Like, we have to ask ourselves about basic resources, about healthy food, about clean water, about these other kinds of things, not about Netflix and Disney and Nike and all these other commodities and other things that we're doing.
This is why we started reading dialogues at night instead of watching Netflix sometimes. I mean, we still watch Netflix, but
I mean, we still will read. I'll call you up and I'll go, hey, let me read to you before I fall asleep. We're reading like Byung-Chul Han.
That's keeping you alive. Like seriously,
Yeah.
like as soon as you start going in the other, you just start to fall asleep.
Yeah.
And I think most people are just so tired. And I know what that's like. I mean, I'm a guilty party too. I mean, there's been a ton of times I'm dead tired. I come home, I just binge watch something, go to sleep, right? But I know, it's not really adding any. It never adds. It amuses me.
Yeah.
But it doesn't add anything to me. And I think that's one of the problems about the paradigm of education is there's a sense of like I learn in order to get the job, in order to have some sort of financial security. Not I learn in order to become a person
Yeah, it's
that has all these things.
Viewing education as a means to an end rather
Right.
than an end in itself is something
And the end is already decided for you. As soon as you say, I'm going to work at Intel, somebody just decided the rest of your life.
Yeah.
However many days that you work, how many hours a week, those belong to the person who decides what tasks you'll do all day. This is very different from like, my grandpa who was a farmer who, he had to cultivate the land and get the wheat out and all that. But he got to decide all the ways that he was going to do it and the width and the wherefore and all that. That was him.
Yeah.
And that's not even, that used to be like the American ground.
Right.
Was farming and then, construction, other things like this. All these things, of course, are disappearing. And so, of course, technology is like the way that most of my students are going in one way or another.
Most Americans for most of America's history were both literate, 98% literacy, and also grew their own food, or at least some of their own food. Most Americans, like Astrid dropped that statistic on me about most people for most of American history grew most of their own food. And it's only like a very recent, in like last 100 years, that there were farming bills that got rolled out as part of the U.S. becoming the military dominant force on the planet. It started using food as a weapon. Wendell Berry writes about this, about the weaponization of food, where we were having to mass produce it so we could dump into poorer economies and say, we're going to bankrupt every farmer in Mexico with NAFTA so that they have to come over here as migrant, illegal, undocumented, and then and half of them committed suicide because that's what happens when you lose your farm. And that was the whole idea of like we produce so much of an overabundance of corn, wheat, and soy so that we can dump it into other economies. They can't compete with it. Then we buy out their land for cheap and then turn that into something else, and now they're working for us. And it's kind of an extension of the enclosure of the commons and colonialism at the same time. And it's just like mind blowing. And that's the Unsettling of America book.
And the outgrowth of that too, like when I think about especially corn, that was heavily subsidized, is the relation to diabetes, right? I mean, so you have all this like corn syrup being made or other corn products. You think about Doritos, Mountain Dew, Coca-Cola. There's all corn syrup in them.
Have you read that book?
Right, and then fast food. So fast food uses, wheat in a major way. Then all the cows that are in your burger, pretty much all of them are eating GMO soy or corn or whatever, something that was mass produced to fatten them up quickly. So they have an undernourished diet, these cows that are just going to be made to slaughter. They're eating like one thing. Then they go into the McDonald's burger. Then you have the wheat that the soil depletion is major. Then you're drinking Coca-Cola with this. So you're eating food, your stomach has to digest it, but the amount of nutrition that is going into your body is almost zero, right? And this is all of America. You can read like Fast Food Nation or other books like that, and you see the history of this, right? And it's totally tied to capitalism. Well, now we're starting to really see the results. We were starting to see them, but they're ramping up. The amount, one of the last polls I read was saying that more people in this generation, their children will die before them. Mostly the major one is diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is actually preventable. It's not like type 1 diabetes.
I was going to say, if Bloomberg's children were as likely to die of type 2 diabetes as they were likely to catch COVID, then that would have become the biggest issue of the last couple of decades. But because they eat quality food and that's not a problem, but they could still catch COVID became the problem, right? Because his kids are not going to they're not going to die from type 2 diabetes or cancer. They don't have to really worry about things because they get to eat the good food, right?
Yeah.
But this is like the vicious circle, right? I mean, like, so my student, he gets his degree at Intel or whatever. He's always in a rush. He has to wake up early, in the morning to get to his job. He's already tired because he read, go watch Netflix or whatever. And so he gets his breakfast at like Starbucks, or he gets it at like McDonald's or something because he's too tired to make a breakfast in the morning. Then he's pumping, mochas or Mountain Dew or energy drinks all day to get his work done. He comes home tired. So he's got this nutritionally sapped food system that if you do right, it's going to take you like an hour and a half to make each meal. Where do you have that? You start stacking that up, 3 meals a day, an hour and a half a piece to prepare them. Where do I get that much time? People feel like they don't have it. Why don't they? Because their work is more faster. All the labor that you do is going to be, if you're paid a salary or if you're paid a wage, they're going to try to get you to do the most that they can in an hour. That's just the way it works. So they're pushing you, they're squeezing you. Now it's more intellectually than physically in the factory line. That's become the new thing. But it's worse because you're actually sitting, which is really bad for you. So you're sitting in this chair, but your mind's supposed to be really sharp and you're supposed to work really fast. So you're guzzling tons of coffee or energy drinks or whatever. You're not eating good, you're eating at your desk, so that means you're probably eating fast food or whatever. So then you're going to really need good insurance because then you're going to be going to the doctor more. And the doctor's going to have bad news for you more often, and it starts depleting and you start getting freaked out. So then you become more possessive and more frightened about your money and so forth. You become paranoid, you become angry, all these are just natural consequences of when I look at people and I look at their desperation and their anger and some of these things, I don't blame them. I don't even think it's moral. Like I feel like if I was doing the same thing that they did, I would become that person over time.
This is why I brought up Thomas Frank and the professional meritocracy thing, because what the whole mode of that professional managerial class, like politics, is one that aims to humiliate and scapegoat the overwhelming majority of regular working people who then get, like I said, scapegoated for all of these problems.
Right.
So it's like, well, I think I might have got a lot of that from you, this basic empathy for, Joe Schmo's working like this, 50 to 70 hours a week, watching Netflix and drinking a six-pack in the evening. We blame that person for like the shitty, dysfunctional life that they're living, instead of looking at the fact that, wait a minute, but why are they working 50 to 70 hours a week and scraping?
It's inhuman. So who's screwed up? The guy who becomes an alcoholic because the only time he ever feels good is when he has a drink at the end of the day. He gets a couple hours at the end of the day where he feels a little bit happy before he goes to sleep. That's all he has. The rest of the time he's miserable. He's at a job that's inhuman and murderous to his imagination, his mind, his body, and then he's doing it for his kid because he wants something better for his kid. Things just keep getting worse and worse. Who's immoral? The guy because he drinks, and he should work even harder and then he could get that promotion, but he didn't get that promotion. Yeah, or something like that. Is it that, or is it the people who created a job that just demands more and more and more and doesn't give a shit whether the people are getting sicker or disappearing, as long as they've got someone else to come in and fulfill the position that has needs? It's totally inhuman and gross. And I think that's the thing, is when you actually look at it, and when I look at my students, they don't want the job that they're going to go get. They're just afraid of getting the worst job, right? So it's not that they want to work at Intel because that's their dream in life. It's because they're paranoid of working some other job that's even worse. So they're just trying to because apparently there's no other option. And instead of saying that the conditions of labor are inhuman and have to be changed, and demanding that not economic differences in that sense, but actually labor itself, where you go to work, has to change. Demanding like a 4-hour workday.
Right.
Demanding that everyone has health insurance. Demanding that there be higher standards for the FDA because they're not doing jack shit to protect us against food that is obviously corrosive to our bodies and causing us diabetes and all kinds of things. It's clearly obvious, and they're like, well, there's no correlation. That's just demonstrably false, actually. But anyway, just allowing someone to ask the question about, well, how would I prefer to live? Is it possible to work only 4 hours a day? The neocons will say no. But of course it is. How much food do you need to eat? Like Buddhist monks eat one meal a day, and they're living to be like some guy recently died at 103, he's like eating one meal a day. He didn't starve to death. He's eating one vegetarian meal a day. He's healthy. Now, I'm not going to say his lifestyle of meditating and stuff might not be very helpful, but my point is, like, some people think, well, like, how much does the body need? We go back to Diogenes, right? We remember Diogenes, like the Cynics, right?
They're eating one him through you.
Yeah, they're eating one meal a day, and they're proving to people, like, you don't, if you eat nutritionally, I could eat 10 meals a day of McDonald's, and I'll have less nutrition than I eat one good meal a day, because we're not getting nutrition, and then our bodies are bogged down digesting, which takes hours and hours and hours, food that has nothing to give me back.
Yeah, you can tell just by
you
how
can
you
just,
feel
yeah,
when
you just
eat like
feel.
beans and lentils and like all these
Pizza
grains
yesterday.
and stuff. Versus,
It
we on our
slows you
drive
down.
up, we're like, we just need something, stopped at a pizza, and we're like starving in a few hours, not feeling so good.
It tore us up, yeah.
So I think, like, and I talk to my students about like going out into nature or something, and they always are like, oh man, I wish I could go out and go hiking more, things like that. People know what they want.
Exactly.
It's just that they're being told, like, well, that's not an option. Like, you have to live in a 1-bedroom apartment in the city and work at Intel or whatever. I'm not picking on Intel, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But anyway,
a $900 a month 1-bedroom apartment now. And by the way,
Yeah.
studio.
and they just keep and it just keeps going up, right? And that's the problem too. So there's just the sense that there's no other option, but clearly that's absurd. We can demand different kinds of conditions for work. The productivity of our work they've actually shown often, especially in creative work, that when people work less, they can be more creative, even at places like Intel or Google or whatever. But why aren't these things being used? Because I do think in part they want to keep people harnessed. They want to keep people working in the way that they've been doing it, and I think keeps them sort of docile
Yeah.
or dependent. I don't know. I wouldn't do a whole analytic on that, but I just.
Well, they go start developing open source software that would make their proprietary system like irrelevant, which is almost always what happens whenever software developers, programmers have a little bit of leisure time. They start having conversations with one another, and because half of them are anarchist, socialist, communist, the other half are libertarians, they all start being like, well, we can all come together around open source software, and then they all start developing their own side projects, and it's literally not about money, and it's just pure passion, and Apple and Google can't compete with it, and they can hardly appropriate it back because it's open source. And so it's just like, you can't give the programmers too much freedom either, because they'll literally make your company irrelevant.
Yeah.
And
because
but
creativity
they'll
is
give you the
dangerous.
sign value. They'll give you the sign value of that creative, free form, horizontal thing, because you can pick your lunch break and it can be as long as you want, and you can take a nap at your work, and they give you all of these things. Oh yeah, but you still have to get certain amount of things done, and so then that still forecloses all this other stuff.
You're a slave, but you can have beer and potato chips and football. Whereas before you didn't have beer and potato chips and football.
Yeah.
You're like, oh shit, that's better.
Yeah.
Nobody
Better
says
than my dad,
you can be free, right? Just don't bring that up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, going back to Diogenes, that was the kind of proof
Actually,
of...
you have to tell her who Diogenes is. I'll be right back.
The proof of life was that, so Socrates' most famous disciple is Plato, right? But he has a second disciple who's not as famous, who is called Antisthenes. And Antisthenes just followed the way that Socrates lived. So he wasn't as interested in the intellectual aspects. He wanted to live like Socrates. Well, Socrates went around with wearing one cloak and being barefoot and letting his hair grow long and eating one meal a day often. And so he imitated that as a form of life. He thought, if Socrates was somebody who essentially knew what the good was, if I just imitate that, I will move in the direction of Socrates' virtue.
Yeah.
So he lives in this way. Basically, it was a radical minimalism by today's standard. And he had a disciple. His name is Diogenes.
Okay.
And Diogenes is probably most famous for this story about Alexander the Great, who comes and visits him, and he asks him, he tells him he'll give him a kingly favor, which people did this in this era. They would offer you a boon or whatever, and they'd say, ask me anything you want and I'll do it for you. And so he comes to a Diogenes and he asks him, I'll do this kingly favor for you. And Diogenes says, I don't need anything, but you can stand out of my light. And when Alexander leaves, Alexander says, if I wasn't already Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes. And so it's a very famous saying, and the reason why is because Diogenes goes around with one cloak, barefoot, eating one meal a day in the same way. He has literally nothing. He sleeps in this barrel. That's his home.
Okay.
And he does it to kind of show off to people, like, you don't need that much and you can live well. Then what becomes so important about this story is that Alexander goes out and gets everything that he wants. Like, he conquers the Persian Empire. He keeps conquering. He goes all the way to India, where he finally loses, and he comes back. And he just becomes miserable. He gets everything he wants. He dies one night of essentially alcohol poisoning. And that night he's very angry and bitter. And he just dies very discontent, even though he got everything that he wanted.
Yeah.
Well, in the exact same day that he dies, Diogenes apparently dies that exact same day, but at the age of 90, whereas Alexander was only 33.
Oh, wow.
And he dies in his sleep, and he dies contented, and he dies, poor, living in a barrel.
Yeah.
And so people saw this contrast between the two figures, because here was somebody who had nothing and was content, and when he was asked, do you want, I'll give you anything, he says, I don't need anything, you can get out of my light. And then the other guy envies him to the point where he says, if I wasn't already this person, I'd rather be that guy.
Yeah.
Well, the guy has nothing, why would you want to be that guy? And at the end of his life, he gets even more. And he's miserable. He dies of overconsumption of alcohol, he's unhappy. Whereas the other guy has nothing, dies in his sleep, very content.
Yeah, well, that's really
So it became this kind of paradigm of life's lived, like what is it that you need in order to be happy? For the ancient world, all the way through the Stoics and the Roman Empire, people would always point to Diogenes.
Better to die Diogenes.
Yeah.
And that's not how the saying goes, is it?
No, but that's the basic premise, right? Is that the Cynic life offered something, this kind of radical contentment by proving that human beings, you don't need a bunch of power and prestige to be happy, and you don't need a bunch of commodities to be happy. And so for example, these tribes in the Amazon are proving it. I mean, they're trying to keep all these corporations and stuff out of the Amazon where they live because they don't want Nike and Reebok and Mountain Dew and Coca-Cola, and they don't want Big Macs. They want the life that they have, and they don't care about prestige or power or all these material things that the world could potentially offer them. They want to keep living the way they live because they see the value in it. And the American capitalist looks at it and says, like, well, they have nothing. Why would you want to, eat bugs and hunt birds and, drink water that looks kind of dirty or something? Well, because nobody tells them what to do, and they have to subsist, but they know how to do it in the world that they live in. And they don't want to be incorporated and
subsumed.
Yeah.
Colonized. Well, this is a good chance for me to ask a question, but I mean, actually, wait, she's gonna go. We're both really getting into like homesteading, homeschooling, traveling to other countries, and with my background, coming from homeschool, but a homeschooling system that didn't have any resources, and my parents had no time or energy, so it was kind of like not really even educational in a way, and I wanted to go to public school, but I wasn't allowed to, and so my rebellion, and all, coming from all that, for me now, and also like having spent some time in the university now, and having been through some political organizing and getting a sense for where everything's at, as it all comes together for me, it's like, well, what really matters is making it so that people who want to go educate themselves or educate their children or whatever it might be, develop some kind of a 6-person group or a homeschooling cooperative, or there's all kinds of different ways of doing this, making sure they have the resources at their disposal to be able to go at their own speed and be able to find and connect with other people who will be able to also do that, because I was anti-homeschooling for a while, and now I'm not anti-university or anti-public schools either, but my whole thing is just like, well, people just don't know what the options are, and people don't, and even when they try, they end up failing because they don't know what the options are, and a lot of these homeschool kids are so awkward because they're not socialized, and so it's like, well, if you're gonna do it, you need to be able to do it with others, and you need to have resources so you know what you're doing, and right now it's just like moms trying to raise their kids or whatever, they just don't have the resources, so they get these Saxon math books and then these Texas religious propaganda books, and they're teaching that because they see that as meaningful as opposed to the secular, meaningless public school education. It's like, no, there's more.
Yeah, the obvious problem is like there's a reason why you pay an elementary school teacher to do what she does, is because that's what she studied for, and that's what she keeps doing every day, and she knows how to do it well. If you're a mom and you're doing all these other things, and then you're trying to teach several subjects, and then each time your kid gets a year older, you have to keep, so the average elementary school teacher, for example, they're just teaching their 1 grade or whatever. When you're a mom, you're going to have to go all the way until you let your kid go to school. So you didn't specialize, and you didn't repeat and learn from your mistakes and be like, oh, I can do this better. And it's going to be harder to keep your kid up to a good level of, I especially think about math and some of these other different sciences. So it's resources, but at the same time, you're right. I mean, I think that the schools are fairly inframed. Like, they're teaching certain things well, and now with STEM and stuff, there's going to be way more emphasis on science because technology industry and so forth. But the humanities are dying. So the problem is, what kind of person are we going to become? Not just whether we're really good at math and science.
And that's
then I'm just a machine.
Right, and that's a perfect segue into my other thing. So I think where I was at when I met you was I was basically like into Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker, and you could characterize that in a variety of ways, but it was part of like the new atheist, rationalist, positivist thing that was happening on the internet at the moment, and we would have conversations, and I had you in my head pegged to be an atheist, anarcho-communist type person. And then like one day I said something offhanded about the Bible, and you were just like, I don't know what you said or how, but my impression was, oh, I don't know what I'm talking about. I actually need to read the Critique of Pure Reason and Being in Time before I can really have this conversation with you. Because you basically said, I can't do it for you. You have to do it. You have to read these things. You have to take it seriously, and you have to engage. And I was the president of a club who had a lot of influence over like the people who were a part of that, and we were all really engaged. And so the fact that you did that to me right then, I was just like, whoa. And then that's why I eventually was like, talk to us about Marx, because nobody here at this campus wants to talk about that. And you're an anarchist, but you still like this guy who's considered to be anti-anarchist. So what is there of value there? I need to know. And then you gave a series of talks on that. But that combined with your ethics talks also gave me like the human, or to become a person, that means something. And then, Estranged Labor was probably the most impactful thing I ever read, which is ultimately, there is a humanistic thing here where he's basically saying there is the dehumanizing, like people don't get to develop their potential aspect of work, that if the society's only, revolving around the commodification of labor. But what is this? When you think about it, when you say human, what is that as opposed to animal, or is there an opposition here, or like how do you think about like the development of a human, or what does that mean outside of a strictly rationalist, positivist kind of a thing, or how does that call that into question?
Okay, so it's a lot. It's a really huge question that I'd never be able to do justice to. First of all, I would say even Richard Dawkins, I mean, he comes out of a kind of Enlightenment rationalist tradition, which again just goes back to Kant and Hume and Locke and Descartes, right? And I'm in line with the essential, I mean, a kind of scientism or even positivism shares something that I share with it, which is I do believe that people can do basic logic. And if people can do basic logic, you can build a hell of a lot from that. A hell of a lot. Now, can a deer do that? Or a gorilla? I don't think so. I'm not saying that, we're starting to learn more and more about higher apes and dolphins, and we might start to learn some interesting things eventually. But at this point, I don't think that any other creature on the planet has the ability to take what it has in its mind and then continually extrapolate. It starts with this very basic amount of ability to do grammar, logic, and then build from that into all kinds of beautiful languages and do things with language, poetry, science, all kinds of stuff, mathematics, right? My concern with a hard scientism or positivism is that it's too reductive of human beings to being strictly biologically motivated. So I just don't think that it plays out. I mean, I could talk about very sophisticated arguments. We could talk about Kant and his argument essentially for the spontaneity of the imagination, which is hard epistemology. But I might just give some really stupid, simple kind of example, which is that if human beings are biologically determined, and that is the number one things that are important for the evolution of the species are to survive one more day, survive, and then procreate. If I'm a procreating, live one more day survivor, how come people kill themselves over concepts of love, or because they don't think God exists? they're not living a single more day. It's not helping them procreate. How come people pursue art when it will make them no money and people hate their art and they just keep doing it anyway? It's not helping them economically. They have to live in poverty. Again, Diogenes. Why pursue some creative endeavor of mind or physicality or self or social thing or being a mother or something like that? Why pursue some of these things in a creative way when it really adds nothing to my basic survival? It won't. But people constantly sacrifice being able to procreate more or even life itself for an idea. People will kill themselves over an idea, over not believing that love is real or that God doesn't exist or something, a figment of their fucking imagination maybe, right? They'll kill themselves over now, someone might argue, well, that's just a tiny percentage, so that they don't matter. But I don't think that it is. I mean, a lot of people won't kill themselves, but they feel that life isn't worth living, and they might continue to subsist. But in themselves, within their mind, they've given up on living, basically. They continue to subsist, but there's no life. That's my difference. If we're just life for no other purpose almost than to sort of expand in the evolutionary process of basic kind of expansion notions, and not something more spontaneous, not something more creative, artistic, then kind of what's the point? And why do I feel that at all? Like I shouldn't even care. Like it shouldn't matter to me. Why does it matter to me so much? And not just me, but people everywhere. And I feel like when I talk to people all the time, when I get down to this moment with them, they're like, damn it, yeah, like I don't want to live in this way. Like I've always wanted to live in that way, but I feel like I can't, right? So, Bakunin, here's my anarchist roots. Saint Bakunin, who didn't believe in God, who believed that everyone had the instinct to rebel. And I love that you can have something, and you can even have it all, right? You can be the billionaire, and you're sitting on the beach somewhere, and tears are streaming down your face, and everything external is beautiful. You got the beach, you got your Corona sitting there, you got $1 billion in your bank, and on the inside, your states of consciousness suck, and you just wish you were dead, right? Because some other part of you demands more. You rebel against this. You say, not this. It can't be this. There's something more than this. And a kind of positivism, but the problem with positivism is it often just demands that truths only exist so long as I can demonstrate them through science, logic, or mathematics. Otherwise, we don't talk about them because they're not demonstrable. This is Kant's fault, basically, because he made this distinction between what could be said and what couldn't be said, basically, through his epistemology and critique of pure reason. But he also left open big questions, very big questions like God, the soul, freedom, and so forth. And he called them, well, they're called antinomies, but he also said that you had to especially believe in freedom in order to believe in morality. The human mind has to have a logical component, but it also has to have a spontaneity to do. Otherwise, we can't be moral. And that's a really big, important claim. So he says he can't prove freedom, but he says it's a practical axiom. Basically, the only way I can find out is if I'm free is if I fucking do something crazy, like throw this across the room, which I won't do because it still has stuff in it, and then someone would have to clean it up. But if it was empty, I would have done it just to prove to you that I can. Every once in a while, just get up and dance,
Yeah.
or just to prove to yourself, like, it's a practical axiom, right? That the only way that you can know that you're free is if you do something.
You just became a body without organs for us.
Right.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So, from an epistemological point of view, yes, human beings have a certain kind of mind, and that's cool, and that makes us different from, the elk and the polar bear and whatnot. But it's not just our minds that make us what we are. It's our rebellion, which in Hegel is just the notion of negation. You've read Phenomenology of Mind, so I can point you to that, right? Negation for Bakunin is rebellion. If the mind can just say, not this. Now, it's huge if the mind can do that.
Or why?
Because can animals do that? For example, I could live in a society that was like a totalitarian society, but according to Kant and Bakunin and Hegel, there's always this possibility to be like, I don't know what I want. I can't tell you what I want. I just fucking know I don't want this. And that's the first step that takes you to some other thing, whatever small action it is, that you won't even know. You'll kind of invent it in an instant. And then from there, maybe that leads to an insight or an epiphany. See, this is a thing that doesn't follow with positivism for me, because if you look at the history of human beings, there's not just like technologies and sciences that are quote unquote invented, but actual ideas come into existence. They didn't exist before. And an actual individual brought that into being, just like a new form of painting comes into being with like Impressionism. Somebody begins something, and then other people follow it, and then some other thing happens. The fact that the human mind is not just mathematical, scientific, and then whatever's true is what can be proved in that way, but that we piss on things just for fun in the snow or whatever, and that we paint pictures that are ugly, nobody wants to buy and nobody cares about, and we write music that only we will hear, just because that's the spontaneity of human creativity. And damn it, like some, like I think if you ever heard of Daniel Johnston, he's probably not super well known. Kurt Cobain wore a t-shirt at SNL that made him kind of well known, that had an icon that he drew on it, and he did it as a kind of homage to him. But he just had this little recorder, and he would record these songs that he'd play on the piano or his guitar, and later some of them were being put out in tapes or whatever. Anyway, I think he's still alive, but he got mental illness fairly young. But here's this guy who just does something because he wanted to. He wasn't making any money. He got no power. It wasn't getting him laid. It wasn't helping him subsist. But he's kind of this beautiful person who wrote these songs. He just kind of recorded on this little recorder. And there's just people everywhere doing something like that are like that. And they're kind of in defiance to reality. That's sort of what I love about Plato, is that the concept of the soul is like defiance to reality. The reality tries to keep you hemmed in, but the soul wants to fly. Why? So my problem is, like, there's too many kinds of truth that are creative like that. And if we only reduce truth to what fits with the verification principle of truth, which is that I have an idea that can be put within sense perception or logic and then verified, that reduces so much of our life to this insanely narrow spectrum. That's why I call it's a reductionism. Positivism is an insane reductionism, and so is scientism, because we're all these other things too. There are truths about our emotional life, our social life, about inner states of kind of power and feeling that we have when we say listen to music, that transform us. I mean, I've literally read biographies about people who went to a symphony, and when they came out, they were a different person. Badu likes to talk about events, but he's not talking about them the way I am. I'm talking about it in like a Kierkegaardian sense, like that people have things that happen to them, and somebody wrote a piece of music, and it came out of themselves, and some other person listened to that piece of music, and by listening to it, it transformed them, such that when they left the concert hall, from that moment on, they were a different kind of person. And they can even trace it back and say, some truth occurred to me through that music. It's not the kind of truth that's like 2 + 2 is 4.
Right.
Dostoevsky, 2 + 2 is 5. And I will always write it that way just to say, fuck you, because mathematics can't tell me what to do. Right? I mean, it's humorous because it's in Notes from Underground and the whole piece is funny. But that whole sentiment or idea, that's existentialist as a notion, that over mathematics, over utilitarianism, there's this human freedom. That's what's in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. And that truth is a truth, but it can't, I think that's why it came out best in a novel, in Nietzsche's aphorisms and people like that, because you couldn't put it into a kind of theoretical form like an analytical treatise. But you get what Dostoevsky's saying in Notes from Underground. You get it. You're like, I get it. But he's writing in this humorous way that's this one speaker that later was performed as a play. Nietzsche went and saw it, and it totally, I won't put words into his mouth, but it basically transformed it. He says it transformed his life. He went to this reading, but it wasn't a reading. He gave it as the Man from Underground. It was basically a play. It was the guy, he gives the whole speeches.
Performed a monologue.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
He performed it, thank you, performed the monologue on a stage, and he just loved Dostoevsky after that. But he never read Brothers Karamazov, which is too bad, because that would have been a really interesting moment. And somebody gave him a bunch of Kierkegaard, and he was going to read it, and he lost his mind. So I would have really loved to hear his reaction to someone like Kierkegaard, but we never got that either. But here's this kind of transformational thing, like in literature or reading Kafka or something, because Kafka talks about, this, you see this facing of the absurdity of life. The absurdity is such that you demand something else, but I think in a lot of the stories you have no idea what it is. It's just, the story portrays this just grotesque kind of absurdity of the person's existence. And that's it, that's the story. But it leaves you feeling this sort of repulsion, I suppose, for a kind of everyday, average existence. And Kafka had to work this horrible bureaucratic job, and he's writing these stories in his free time or whatever. But anyway, yeah, my basic point is just that positivism is a frame, and it had practical application. It was trying to do something good. It was trying to say, these are the things that we can communicate well, and everyone can understand the same thing. But the problem of the demand was not the positive side that, look, these things we can all communicate, cool. It became, no, you can't talk about anything else but what fits within this frame of the communicable, the logic and linguistic. But even Wittgenstein, right, he sees like this isn't good enough because the linguistic, ordinary language, right, he says, is not the kind of language of Tractatus. When we talk to each other on a regular basis, we don't talk to each other in logical aphorisms, that link together in some form like that. So,
But that's almost like the development of just literally a new language. So what analytic philosophers do when they go, oh, people are talking about justice, well, that means this, or that, and then,
yes.
then they move into, and now they're in some other register of reality,
Yeah.
and they keep working in a different register that's
Right.
completely removed from the register everyone else is
Yes.
using when they're talking. Yeah.
So it's a removal from, I would say, real life to a kind of symbolism or hieroglyphic of life. And the problem with this is because that picture has become so dominant within the economy, because the economy is largely technology-based industry. Therefore, the industry's language, if you want to say, is a science language, science math language. It has no openness to a world that's the everyday world, the blood and guts, existence of it's the especially economy, when it became more about numbers. You think about money becomes like numbers. It's not what Marx said, which was dead capital over living wages. So the point of it, something dead, numbers, schematics, all this stuff over someone's real fucking life. That's their life.
Their exhaustion,
No.
their opportunities.
Right.
Yeah.
Now we have all these polls. Like last time I called the doctor, I was going in for an appointment, or they want to they want you to give some from 1 to 5 about everything. They want to collect data on everything, and they want it to be numeric. So there's all these polls about work and labor and proficiency and blah, blah, blah. There's not a single picture of the fucking human being who does it, right? It's just you become a schematic. And I mean, I live in the rate your professor world, so I have it too. You become numeric. Who you are becomes these numbers of like what you get polled on, not the sense of what your living reality is when you're actually in the classroom and you teach. And everybody's getting this. Everybody's getting it everywhere. And we're all being like polled and rated. And somewhere it's going into big data. And then somebody who's running things is like, look, there seems to be a weakness here. They're not asking themselves whether this year, like their wife had cancer and that's why they're not as good of a teacher this year or something. They're just like, oh, the numbers are a little bit down here. We need to figure out how to bring this back up to whatever. But the thing is that it's sort of ironic, I think, too, is that even the people who are on the top, it comes back to them too. So we're all being just demanded to just do more faster until we die quicker and are sick most of the time. We're making ourselves sick. We're slowly killing ourselves. We can see where we're going and it's not good. And we have this, I think, instinctual sense that there is other way, there's another way to live, or many other ways to live. We're at this kind of, I don't know, twilight or dawn or something between darkness, light. Like we haven't come out yet, but we have a sense that there's something else than darkness, I guess. Because I think everything looks pretty bad. And it looks worse when you look down the future. And so I think people at least are also becoming more aware. It's clear that there's other ways to live. We don't have to live in this way. And we have to fundamentally re-ask the question, because the powers which are largely economic are only taking us in one direction right now. And that is just like more Netflix, more Disney, more consumption, so I just have to be on my phone or my computer constantly just to keep my job. And then at the same time, raising the amount of cost of everything, demanding me to work more. It's just suicide. It's just suicide. It's clearly suicide. And it's not.
It's only temporary because those... Have you read Platform Capitalism by Nick Sternachek?
No. But I've heard, yeah.
The model of these platforms is one where they are taking a huge loss for a long time and giving it all away for free while people are speculating on the hope that they gain a monopoly in the future, and then they'll raise the subscription fees and the tiers. Yeah. And so what it is right now is like workers for now get Netflix. Workers for now get Disney Plus. But we're about 15 years away from, you're going to have to be, you did really, really good in school, and then you were also very, very lucky, and now you actually get to have those things. Or you're like watching reruns of Friends, and that's it.
Or you'll be inundated with advertising or something like that, which is equally like, if your mind is consciousness of, then dumping your head full of advertising is just corrosive the way, I feel like drinking strychnine is, because I mean, now Madison Avenue, they literally have neuroscientists working for them, sociologists, psychologists. Like for a 60-minute ad, they are insanely analytical about what works versus what doesn't. And they're starting to mine the unconscious. And when you're paying the money that they pay for like a Super Bowl ad, you want to make sure you get the most emphasis that you can get out of an ad. So that you have these small armies of insanely intelligent people trying to figure out how to make for 60 seconds or 30 seconds your brain assimilate whatever message they want. And they're getting really good at hacking into the mind more. So I feel like the more people watch consumer ads and stuff, the more corrosive it is than it used to be, even, because it's becoming so sophisticated. But I still believe that people have the right to rebel. They do. But the more tired you are, the more passive you are. Your brain is passive because it's exhausted.
I want to kind of just like bring this all back around, let you both say anything that you've got questions on your mind or anything, but just one minor kind of point of order is like the distinction between positivism and scientism, because you use them in the same sentence, and then maybe just like about, so you're talking about Nietzsche, but you're also talking about Kierkegaard, and you said you're Kierkegaardian, but you're also Bakunian, but it also seems like you're also Foucauldian, and you're also a classical guy, and so it's kind of weird for a lot of people, I think, who are used to philosophy professors who specialize or whatever. And so maybe
because they divide everything up into categories.
Yeah. So
instead of reading the text.
What do you think would have happened if Kierkegaard and Nietzsche could have met? You know, like.
Well, I don't think Nietzsche would have become a Christian, but I think they would have probably enjoyed the fact that they both, for example, loved the classics. So they're both existentialist philosophers. So first of all, I can even take the categories and use those. Dostoevsky's considered an existentialist as well. So those categories. Now, why is that important? The existentialists cared about how to live. So did the ancients. And that's a big correlation there. The distinction between positivism and scientism that I wanted to give is a positivist may not be a scientivist, and a scientivist may not be a positivist. Positivism, man.
Positivism.
Thank you. It can be purely a logical kind of distinction and not relate to the sciences at all. Wow. So it's just about logic. It's just about analytical distinctions and doing analytical work.
If it's not demonstrable, it's not real. Is that how you define
yes.
that?
Yes. In a kind of tractatist kind of sense of the early Wittgenstein, like what can be said clearly. And if it goes beyond what can be said clearly, we banish it to the dark. That we just won't speak of it. Whereas with people who, what I call scientism is more people who consider the world to be the outgrowth of what we understand from the sciences and evolution, a basic materialism of science. That kind of they might not even be interested in positivism, but what both share is that they have a frame. So the science frame is such to say, well, if you're not willing to talk about this truth within talking about science, it's not real, and it's a figment of your imagination. Whereas the positivists won't even go probably that far. They'll just say, it's not tidy or it's not helpful to talk about things that we can't distinctly demarcate and that have a kind of logical formalism to them. So that's the basic differences. I couldn't remember the other. You said Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and the ancients, and then maybe you said one other philosopher.
You got Heidegger, Foucault, all these different people.
Okay, so Heidegger is
and Marx. Yeah.
Okay, so Heidegger is also an existentialist philosopher. Marx is not considered to be, but he's very much a humanist, and so I think that is very important to who he was. He read the ancients, he read Hegel, he read Kant, all that. He had a PhD in philosophy. Many people like to try to label him as an economist. Well, he did do that, but he was first and foremost a philosopher.
He was critiquing that.
Yeah.
It was a critique of political economy, not political economy. Yeah,
what I love about Foucault, so he links very closely to Marx, systems of power and economy. But then also at the end of his life, what does he go back to? He's giving all these lectures about the ancients at the L'École de France. Like he's talking about the Cynics, and he's talking about the Stoics, he's talking about Plato, and he goes back to these questions of forms of life. That's what he was doing last before he died. And he's reading, because he's writing his 3 volumes of the history of sexuality, and he goes back to the Greeks in order to do that. So except for the first volume, not so much, but the second, third volume is all about the ancients up to the Stoics. So he's doing that, but at the same time he's thinking about these forms of life, and he was very much influenced by Pierre Hadot. And Pierre Hadot wanted to go back to thinking about the ancients not as like, okay, Plato's that forms guy, and Aristotle's the analytics guy, but no, what were they doing? They were looking at forms of life, and they did, rigorous investigation into this. I mean, people forget about Aristotle. I mean, the fundamental question of the politics is like, what idea orients a state? And he thought an idea is what you make your educational system, your economic system, even your military system to be in line with. So when you start a city-state or you want to remold a city-state, what idea is it that we should all share? And he said freedom. He didn't mean freedom to buy and sell more. That's what America became. But it wasn't like that at the beginning. Jefferson and so forth, all these founding fathers, they were influenced by people like Locke and so forth, and they were reading Aristotle and they were reading Kant. I mean, Jefferson can quote Kant by heart. He loved Kant so much.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so they're coming out of this Enlightenment tradition. They're reading the classics because back then education always meant you should read Aristotle, you should read Plato, you should read Cicero and various classics. So the original founding fathers picture of this country was like Aristotle's notion of politics. It was freedom in the sense to be and to become.
Leisure.
Yeah, it was not freedom in the sense of I should be able to sell any commodity at the craziest price so long as the market will bear it. It wasn't like I should be able to sell something that's harmful to people and I know it and get away with it because everything should be marketable. It wasn't that either. It was this sense that a city-state has veneration for an idea and everything that you do should maximize that idea. Because that was the Greek notion of virtue is maximality. Virtue is always more and more power of one kind or another. It builds you up. It's building you up. And
it's like virtue, is that? Maximization
of
power?
So arete in Greek, it means virtue, but it also means excellence. And in fact, it means more excellence. It means having more of something. So this was what was important about life as an art. Like Socrates, Plato talks about this, Aristotle talks about it. Like you take pottery, for example, right? And somebody applies a techne or a technique or an art to raw clay. And they make something that is that has excellence or virtue. And it meant having two things, like functionality, like let's say the pottery works well, like it has a solid handle, it's durable. When I go to get water or put something in it, it functions well. But then also excellence meant it was also beautiful. So if you look at the pottery, someone would do something that they didn't need to do, which would be like paint a god on the outside. Do I need to do that? No. I just need to use it to haul water, and it should have sturdy, the jar handles that came out. No, but they put a fresco on it. They put something beautiful on it. Why? Isn't that a waste of your fucking time?
Right.
No, it's not. It's the beauty. So again, kalos meant both beautiful and good. So Socrates loved saying something about like say a pot or something. The person applies the art, and if he's good at the art, it has virtue. The pot has virtue. It has excellence. It has both functionality, and it goes a little bit above and beyond, and then it's also beautiful. And a person's life can be like that. A person's life can be something that someone looks at and says, damn, that's beautiful. I want to imitate that. I want to learn that art. What is it that they do that makes their life imitatable? You look at it, just like you look at a t-shirt and you're like, I'm going to buy that t-shirt. You look at somebody's life and you say, I like that. I want that same thing. How do I get that? And that's what early philosophy was about, starting with Socrates, and it's what existentialism tries to come back to. When Nietzsche tries to do the reevaluation of all values, he's trying to go back to this. He's like, look, we've lost our way. We have to ask ourselves again, what's valuable? What is it that we most want? Which in part is a question of desire. And especially when you know you don't want what's available, it means you got to ask yourself what you do want. And I feel like nobody wants what's becoming available. I mean, I don't think people really want to be stultified by staring at their computer and their Netflix. I think people do want to go out and be with their kids in nature, and I think they want to build things and create things and read things and talk to people around the fire and learn how to play the guitar. I think people want to do those things, but they're so driven and tired and whatever that then they just kind of they're zombies, you know, scrolling with their one thumb is getting arthritis from so much use, you know. But I feel like I talk to people all the time. I talk to younger people, like my nephews, for example, which are like 13 and 14. They don't want that. They want to, like, I've been taking my nephew skateboarding, you know, because they like that. They look forward to that. I mean, they've got their phones all the time. They got computers and TV with 500 channels on it. They don't want to do that. Like, if I call them up and I'm going to go skateboarding, they're like, yes, let's go skateboarding. Like, so we enjoy other things, and some things like skateboarding or running or something, it also builds you up. So you do it, and it's also good for your health. Sitting in front of a computer screen is not good for your health. Your body needs activity. It needs motion for circulation and for health and all these things. And instead, we're offering people, look, you can get this job and you can sit here and start gaining more and more and more weight and feeling more and more tired. And then in the evening, you don't have anything left, so you just kind of stare into the blankness. And then, you know, the statistical amount of people who have to take sleep aids is insane. The statistical amount of people who are on psychotropics for depression or anxiety is over 50% in this country now. That's crazy. I mean, can you even imagine that? I mean, like, I feel like if you were an alien and you came, you know, and you looked, and you would say there's something wrong with this society. You're doing something wrong. When you see two people, one of them shouldn't be on a prescription drug for anxiety or depression. Like, that's insane.
People try to act like this is all, oh, well, we just didn't have diagnoses for these things back in the day. Now people can get the help they need, is the way they try to spin it.
It's like, but it's in part pharmacon, right? I mean, so we just take the example, like, what happens to a person who sits at a job 8 hours a day where they get zero exercise, and when they get home at night, they're too tired to exercise? What happens when their diet is like largely fast food or meals they can't really prepare? You know, I mean, they're not eating lettuce and tomatoes, and, you know, they're eating maybe something they warm up in the microwave, or who's constantly drinking coffee, which I love coffee, but it's a diuretic. That means, just like alcohol, it flushes nutrients out of your system because you pee, right? So it's like it's constantly flushing nutrients out of your body and your colon. And, you know, and a lot of people are drinking like pop or energy drinks, so they're you know, right now maybe they're fine, but in 10 years or something, they might be headed toward diabetes or pre-diabetes or something. But they're doing it just to function. So all you have to ask yourself is, what is that person's body going to feel like? And since your brain is one of the organs of your body, what's their brain going to feel like? It's not going to be good. So then is it going to be surprising that they're fucking depressed? They get no exercise, they don't eat well. Nothing in their life is good. People's personal relationships are at shit level. Statistically, you look at this. You guys, it's awesome. You have a loving relationship. It's becoming so rare. My wife was talking to me about the limbic brain, you know. We have a limbic brain. And humans need other people. We're a herd animal, basically. And people are being isolated. They live in a studio apartment by themselves. Yeah, they need touch.
Feels, you're like, oh, yeah. It just kind of regrounds you. You're like, and look at mammals. Do you see any mammals that don't, like, get close and touch their loved ones?
No. The apes that they separated from the mother, you know, in that famous test, and they just gave them the little pap that they drank out of, they died, you know. And some babies who had to, because they had health issues, they had to stay in like an incubator much longer. Often when they get older, they don't have an ability to bond correctly and so forth. They basically have a kind of disability because of it. Because you have a limbic brain and you're supposed to be held. I mean, a mother holds you all the time, you know. So anyway, you have these people, they're living in studio apartments. The relationships they have never seem to work out. And partly because of economy. Like my students, like, they're like, I don't want to get into a relationship because that person's going to go over here and I'm going to go over here for a job, and then that'll just hurt my feelings when it doesn't work out. So they set themselves up for failure. They're not willing often to have the courage to try. But the point is, my wife was talking about the limbic brain and how people, she's reading these statistics about how when spouses die, the people often, if they don't remarry or have a friend group that they're always in, like they play bridge with every month or something, they die much quicker, like within maybe 3 years or something often, because, I mean, what she was reading was basically just telling, the conclusion was basically like, if your spouse dies, you need to have a friend group that you see like probably at least bi-weekly, or you need to remarry if you want to live longer, because otherwise you won't. That's just a statistical fact. So then I take that back to like my students who are afraid to get married, and they don't even want to really be in relationships.
Or have kids.
Yeah, or have kids. So they're insanely isolated. The only thing they have is like Disney or whatever they're watching in the evenings to sort of succor them. They're watching their old reruns from a childhood or something. Of course that person's going to be depressed. Of course 50% of the people in our country. Notice, it's not in Africa. It's not in India or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like our country is severely depressed. And so it's not just, I'm not saying that it's not true that people weren't depressed in the past, and maybe they needed, psychotropic drugs for help for that. But it just stands to reason when you look at people's lives, sure, that makes sense, they would be depressed. They wouldn't want to go to work in the morning because their job sucks. Like if you give them a good job, that might be the end of their depression. But they have to keep going back because they have to pay their rent, their car insurance, etc.
Are psychiatrists trained to even, court the question, would I want to be this person?
Right.
Would I want to live their, form of life?
Yeah. Yeah, and so, I'm not bashing psychiatrists, and a lot of psychologists and counselors, they're trying to help people. But, a lot of times it's just sort of like, well, we can identify these things in your past that caused you problems, or we can but there's nothing they can do about, like, your job is what's killing you, friend. Like, you need a different life, and that's why you're depressed, and that's why you're suicidal. Because obviously the psychologist can't go to their employer at Intel and be like, this guy's having trouble, man. Like, you need to give him a better position, at least for a few months, because otherwise he's going to kill himself. They have no power over that, so they just talk about your past, or they give you these kind of implements to remind yourself things during the day, and that's good. That's better than nothing.
Give yourself affirmations before you go to work. That's the job that sucks your soul.
And put this little picture of a green field, like in your, cubicle, and look up at it every once in a while.
Because you still have
that's what green grass looks like. Maybe I'll see that again someday before I die.
Oh, gosh.
Maybe when I retire, and that, they hold that out, I think, almost just like if you behave well, if you do what you're supposed to do, then maybe when you retire, you'll be able to buy this nice little idyllic house somewhere where there's green grass that you can rub your hands on. But I think a lot of people won't make it, especially in this generation, statistically looking at health crises and how they're getting worse and worse. People won't even get that, and they deserve that. They killed themselves working. They deserve an idyllic retirement. But I don't think they're going to get sicker and sicker, and things are going to kill them, because we already have more genetic issues, epigenetics and so forth. They're showing, like, I don't think I'll live to be as old as my grandpa's still alive. He's 97. He lives out on his farm. I will not live to be 97, I do not think. And I don't think I love my dad, my dad's 66. I don't think he'll be 97, But I don't think I'll live to be what my parents' age are, because people are getting everything earlier. So it's even worse because they sort of hold over the sort of like, well, if you're a good boy, then you can maybe have this when you get done. But I don't know if some people will make it, but how many, I don't know. And that's why we have to, fight now in order to have better health care, to have a different augmented picture of retirement and otherwise, because most people, they're not going to make it. They're going to kill themselves working, though. One day their doctor will be like, you have this, you have that, or they'll have a heart attack at work, or... But anyway,
Wow, that's...
I didn't want to end on that. Sorry.
Do you want to say anything before?
No, I'm depressed now.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm inspired to go on a hike.
I'm inspired too.
Yeah, you guys definitely should go out on a day like today, and it's supposed to be nice.
Yeah, well, I have to go grade papers too.
I think we might take a quick run around Tubbs Hill or something before sitting down in Calypso's and
nice.
Pounding out some tasks. So
yeah, that would be really nice.
Yeah,
We should, because The weather's gonna, I think, get a little not so nice
Colder, might
after.
snow.
I think today's the nicest day.
Nice.
She's going to be planting for the next couple of days on my parents' farm while I'm helping my dad build a loft in the shop. So
Cool.
that's kind of the project we're up here for.
Yeah.
But,
Cool.
Anyway, people, Bruce Berman, Gonzaga, thanks for joining.
Yeah,
This is,
you.
you can see why I like them. And you can also probably see where I got, I don't know, it's just like, I'm hearing you say some things where I'm like, dang, I wonder if that's where I got that from, Because like it's something I think about every day, and like that, all my stuff. So and then I'm like, whoa, I just heard you say it, so I might have got it from you. I don't know.
And I got it from somewhere too, because
Right.
I read Heidegger and I read Kant and I read
Yeah.
Plato and Aristotle and Seneca and Cicero and right. So I mean, if you don't have a person, there's always. Seneca says, I can't choose my father. I'm born with the father I have. But I can choose a different kind of heritage. And he points to his bookshelf, right? And he's
Yeah.
like, these are my ancestors, and these are my family. And they're all dead guys, right? Or
Yeah.
gals sometimes. Back then, not as much, unfortunately. Sorry.
Yeah.
Seneca's, Roman era. But you get to choose your lineage. It doesn't always have to be philosophy. It can be art or poetry or science or math or.
Theater.
But choose life, because there is. I tell my students like we face all these very difficult things, but there's one thing that humans have never had in the history of civilization that we have now. And that is like there is a Penguin paperback for like $10 of the greatest wisdom from like China, India, Persia, the West, whatever, that has been translated. I mean, recently you couldn't read it in your own language. It's been translated into my language.
Yeah.
Some monk, some Buddhist monk lived his whole life, wrote 2 pages on his whole experience, and I can read that 2 pages as a summary of like his whole existence of wisdom. I can read that for free on the internet or for $5, $10 from Penguin or something. Nobody has ever had so much wisdom surrounding them.
So
and yet,
accessible.
it's like we're in a boat surrounded by water and people refuse to drink. Like, we can choose something that gives us life, that builds us up every day, makes us feel more alive, or we can just become more and more deadened through all the other media kind of things that there are to deaden your sense. And I'm not bashing film and stuff. I love film. Film is a great medium and it's a great art. And don't get me wrong. I'm more just like, the Marvel superheroes kind of you just stare and watch a bunch of stuff, and when you come out of it, there's no part of you that's greater. Or sometimes I read one haiku, 3 lines, and after that, some part of me is greater. And so I hope people pick that lineage over what I kind of think is just a rising illusion of just, we're spending more of our times in what Baudrillard would call the hyper-real. Man, he had no idea how much the hyper-real was going to become hyper-real. Like, I know so many people that they're just like this, or then they go to their computer, or then they're watching their TV with 500 channels. Their consciousness of is one screen or another almost every hour of the day except when they sleep. And I think people feel like it feels like you're doing a lot. You're on TikTok and you're going through this, that, and the other. But when you ask yourself whether there's been any self-transformation, reading demands you be slow and that you interact with it. And so that means you're involved. Whereas I feel like the other is very passive. And you feel like you're absorbing so much information, but because you're not really doing something, it's not reciprocal. You're not processing like when you read Being in Time. I mean, man, that was going to force you to process, right?
Yeah.
You read the same paragraph again and again. That's transforming you. Whereas otherwise you feel like, I learned a shitload today, and then you ask yourself, what do you remember?
Mm-hmm.
It's much harder to remember things that you absorb in that form than when you deliberatively
go through what is a contemplative process of reading. Because it gives you concentration. You have to learn to concentrate, and you apply that ability of concentration to so many other things.
Do you run into students who say, well, I have ADHD, so I cannot do that very frequently?
And my students who don't say they have ADHD, they cannot. My students in the last 5 years, it is marked. And I'm talking about Gonzaga students. These kids go to prep schools, and they're paying $50,000 a year to go there. And they are having the hardest time reading like 10 pages of philosophy. So it's getting worse. I've seen it every year, especially the last 5 years. I've just seen it. I used to try to get them to read longer things, and I don't like to have to say so, but I've had to compromise into reading shorter bits than I used to have them read because they're not getting through it.
Yeah, and then like in my own experience as a student, I was ready to read hard text, and as a sociology student, I was reading more just like articles. I didn't actually read any primary text my whole degree because the teachers they know they have to adapt to these students, and then the students who are like there to learn, I'm there to read these hard texts, you leave like disappointed.
Yeah.
Like this is my opportunity.
Yeah, which is so sad.
Yeah.
And then you have these professors who they read the Republic and think it's about politics. Like learning how to read is a process of reading.
Yeah.
And not everyone figures it out. They think it's information. No, it's a dialogue.
Yeah.
When you read, there's layers. Especially older texts because people are more sophisticated.
Yeah, and hopefully someday we can get into that because remember I said that you slapped some sense into me just because I took a dump on the Bible or scripture, and I think I was just kind of referring to it as like superstitious stuff, and you're like basically told me that the frames we have for understanding literature, just the main frames we have today cannot do literature, or cannot read a scripture, or cannot interpret, or cannot do this dialogue with, and ultimately the analogy and what's the word?
Allegory.
Allegory is just something that we are not prepared to digest today. And
the older cultures were all allegorical, hence all their myths had symbology within it. Now we don't even understand it. We're like, oh, they're a bunch of idiot, superstitious people. No, like in Hinduism, Kali is not actually black, and she's not an entity. It means everything. Her color, the necklace that she wears around her neck, the emblems that she has, they all mean something. And the old cultures understood that. Reading Carl Jung, I think, really helps that because he looks at the totems and the myths and stuff. Plato's right out of this culture, right? He understands that. And it's also a way of teaching people a mass amount in one image or one poem. So that way people who are illiterate could easily memorize a short poem and keep learning things from it. They keep, oh, that's another layer. Oh, that's another layer. The early Christians, most of them were illiterate, and so they memorized huge amounts of scripture. The rabbis in the old era, they memorized the Torah. Like my Hebrew teacher, when he was in Jerusalem, he said that there was rabbis there, so people still can do it. It wasn't just in the old days. They would play this game where they'd sit in this circle and they would recite from the Torah, and then at any moment one of them would just stop. And then the other person was supposed to pick, and they're doing this in Hebrew, they're not doing it in English. The other person would have to pick up on the exact same word and then start it and go, and they would go until somebody screwed up and couldn't keep doing it. But oral cultures of the past were like that. And Plato was very concerned about the technology, the techne of writing, because he says, if you write something, then you'll put it somewhere, you won't keep it in your mind. And the idea is like, if somebody puts you in a prison cell, you should have all your favorite poetry, all your philosophy right here, and nobody can ever take it away from you. So they were an oral culture, they memorized everything. And they practiced that since they were little children. See, we don't practice that at all, so we're not good at it. But we could be. We don't prioritize it.
got all musical lyrics in my head, so if I go to prison, I'm
You
good.
got that.
I'm good to
She's
go.
good.
Yeah, I'm a theater
Yeah.
person.
Speaking of events, like these events that can transform you, and because of I've gotten into Broadway.
Yeah,
And
cool.
she's got it all in her head, so she's like this jukebox, and I'll be like, something at the perfect time, this line will come to me from some song, and then I'll be like, da, ba, ba, and Anne's like,
I'll finish it.
she's got it all, and so it's
Yeah.
like,
I like Broadway. I was really psyched when they did Green Day's American Idiot as a
Oh,
Broadway.
yeah.
really?
Yeah.
I'm not super familiar with that one.
Yeah.
It exists, yeah.
Do you remember the album American Idiot?
Yeah.
So they did it as a Broadway because it's all the tracks link. So then it was something they could do all together. But anyway, that's the punk rock side of me mixed with the
Nice.
Broadway side of me.
Nice, yeah.
Well, it was so good to see you
Yeah, it
guys
was nice
and
to
meet
meet
you,
you.
Ann. And next time you come through, let me know.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's digest this conversation for a while, and then we'll come back to
Come
it,
back
you
to
know?
it.
Yeah, well, I hope you guys get out and enjoy some
Really.
part of the day. So great to see you, Dave. And I really, at a personal level, I really appreciate the things that you said about my influence. Because as a teacher, that's kind of all you got. You look back and you just hope you transform some people's lives, and something good, right, came out of. You start to wonder. I read all these books. I spent all my life doing this, and then I teach this. Is it making any difference? So it's cool to hear that. It's not that you just learned something, but that it made your life different in a good way.
I was suicidal until you and Kate's.
Yeah.
Until your classes, it's true. And
I
ever
was-
since then, I've just been like, life is awesome, and I'm passionate about it, even though everything's messed up. So it's, yeah.
I was suicidal before I came to philosophy a lot too. Philosophy really, it gave me a structure for learning how to ask the questions that I felt but I didn't know how to articulate.
Yeah.
And then started to find answers. Anyway,
Cool, man.
yeah, I love you guys, and let me know if you come back to town.
Oh, we will.
If I go to Boise sometime,
Yeah, let us know.
I'll send you a text.
Awesome. See you later.
Like, follow, subscribe.